Hey guys, let's kick this off with a grim little question. What's worse than being married to Henry VIII? Answer: being Henry VIII. The man who turned beheading into a personality trait didn't just die because he was a tyrant with a temper and a thing for chopping blocks. No, his royal lifestyle was a slow-motion catastrophe, a masterclass in self-destruction wrapped in velvet robes and dripping with gravy. Picture a life where every feast is a health hazard, every doctor's advice is a gamble, and your own body is plotting against you harder than any scheming courtier. Ready for a wild ride through the Tudor court's gluttony, absurdity, and sheer survival horror? Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Let's start at the beginning, or at least the part where Henry VIII's life starts looking less like a royal triumph and more like a tragicomic disaster flick. We're talking about a king who, in his youth, was the Renaissance equivalent of a rock star. Tall, athletic, golden-haired, and charming enough to make foreign ambassadors swoon. He was the guy who could joust, hunt, dance, and probably write a sonnet about it afterward. But by the time he hit his 40s, Henry was less Prince Charming and more cautionary tale about what happens when you live like a human landfill. His death in 1547 wasn't some sudden plot twist. It was the grand finale of a lifestyle that screamed, "I'm invincible," while his body whispered, "Mate, you're a ticking time bomb." Let's set the scene. It's the early 16th century, and England's court is a glittering cesspool of ambition, intrigue, and questionable hygiene. Henry's in charge, and he's not just ruling a kingdom. He's living like every day is a medieval Coachella. His palaces are stuffed with tapestries, gold plates, and enough food to feed a small army. The man didn't just eat, he feasted like he was auditioning for the role of human trebuchet. A single meal could include roasted swans, peacocks, and entire boars, all drowned in sauces so rich they probably had their own titles of nobility. And don't forget the wine. Barrels of it guzzled with the enthusiasm of a man who thought sobriety was for peasants. This wasn't just indulgence, it was a flex, a way to show Europe that England's king was richer, grander, and hungrier than anyone else. But here's the kicker. Henry's diet wasn't just excessive, it was a one-way ticket to an early grave. Let's break it down. The Tudor elite didn't exactly have a balanced food pyramid. Their idea of nutrition was piling meat on top of more meat, with a side of bread and maybe a sad boiled vegetable if they were feeling adventurous. Fruits? Barely touched. Greens? Suspiciously absent. Sugar, though? Oh, Henry loved his sweets. Marzipan, candied fruits, and sugary confections were his jam. Literally. This was a time when sugar was so expensive it was basically the cryptocurrency of the 16th century, and Henry was hodling hard. Problem is, his body wasn't built for this. Nobody's was. His diet was a perfect storm of high calories, low nutrients, and zero regard for what we now call moderation. Add to that the fact that Tudor food prep wasn't exactly Michelin star quality. Meat was often preserved in salt or smoked to the point of being more sodium than protein. Spices like pepper and cinnamon were used to mask the taste of meat that was, let's say, past its prime. Food poisoning, more like food roulette. Every bite was a gamble, and Henry was rolling the dice with every course. Now, let's talk about the royal gut. By his 30s, Henry was already packing on the pounds. Paintings from the time show a man whose waistline was starting to betray his once athletic frame. By his 40s, he was waddling toward obesity, his body groaning under the weight of his lifestyle. Historians estimate he ballooned to over 300 pounds, maybe more. His armor from later years had a waist measurement of 54 inches. 54 inches. That's not a king, that's a castle with a crown. And this wasn't just a cosmetic issue. Obesity in the 16th century wasn't just unflattering, it was a death sentence. No one knew about cholesterol or diabetes back then, but Henry's body was screaming for an intervention. His heart, his joints, his everything, they were all begging for a salad. But salads weren't sexy in Tudor England. Meat was power, and Henry was all about power. Speaking of power, let's not forget the psychological toll of being Henry VIII. This was a man who didn't just rule a country. He ruled the room, the conversation, the very air everyone breathed. He was paranoid, volatile, and surrounded by people who either worshipped him or wanted him dead. Stress. Oh, Henry had stress in spades. His obsession with producing a male heir turned his love life into a soap opera, with an executioner's axe as the season finale. 6 wives, 2 beheaded, 1 dead in childbirth, 1 divorced, 1 annulled, 1 widowed. Henry's marital track record was less romantic and more serial killer with a budget. The constant scheming, the betrayals, the rebellions, it all weighed on him, and not just metaphorically. Stress hormones like cortisol were probably having a field day in his bloodstream, making his body hold on to fat like it was planning for a siege. And then there's the jousting. Oh, the jousting. In his younger days, Henry loved nothing more than strutting out in gleaming armor, charging at opponents and basking in the crowd's cheers. He was good at it too, until he wasn't. In 1536, at age 44, Henry took a catastrophic fall during a joust. His horse rolled over him, and he was knocked unconscious for 2 hours. 2 hours. That's not a nap, that's a medical emergency. This accident was a turning point. His leg was mangled, possibly fractured, and it never healed properly. Chronic ulcers developed, oozing and stinking, turning his leg into a Tudor version of a horror movie prop. The pain was relentless, and so was the infection. Doctors back then weren't exactly board certified. Their treatments ranged from useless to actively harmful. Leeches, mercury, and prayers, those were the cutting-edge medical interventions of the day. Henry's leg wound became a lifelong companion, a festering reminder that even kings can't outrun biology. This injury didn't just hobble him physically, it changed his personality. The once vibrant king became moody, irritable, and downright tyrannical. Pain does that to a person, especially when you're surrounded by sycophants too scared to tell you to take it easy. Instead of resting, Henry doubled down on the feasts, the hunts, the endless displays of royal excess. His leg wound was like a ticking clock, counting down to his inevitable collapse. And yet, he kept going, because stopping would mean admitting weakness, and Henry VIII didn't do weakness. He did power, he did spectacle, he did more. More food, more wine, more wives, more executions. His court was a circus, and he was the ringmaster, cracking the whip while his body begged for mercy. Let's not ignore the booze either. Henry didn't just drink, he drank like prohibition was coming tomorrow. Wine, ale, mead, whatever was in the goblet, he was downing it. Alcohol was safer than water in Tudor times, which says more about the water than the alcohol. The Thames was basically a sewer, and clean drinking water was a fantasy. So, Henry and his court guzzled fermented beverages like they were the elixir of life. Spoiler, they weren't. Alcohol wreaked havoc on his liver, his kidneys, and probably his brain. Chronic drinking doesn't just make you tipsy. It inflates your organs, clouds your judgment, and makes you think marrying Anne of Cleves was a good idea. Spoiler, it wasn't. Combine that with his diet, and you've got a recipe for gout, diabetes, and a whole parade of ailments that Tudor doctors didn't even have names for. Oh, and speaking of doctors, let's talk about the medical experts of the time. These guys were less Hippocratic oath and more hope and a prayer. Tudor medicine was a mix of astrology, superstition, and herbs that might as well have been plucked from a random field. Henry's physicians were terrified of him, which didn't exactly inspire bold, innovative treatments. If they suggested anything too drastic, like, say, Your Majesty, maybe skip the 3rd helping of swan, they risked losing their heads, so they stuck to safe, useless remedies. Bleeding was a favorite. They'd slice open a vein and let the bad blood flow, as if Henry's problem was an excess of enthusiasm. Spoiler, it wasn't. His body was falling apart, and his doctors were basically throwing darts at a board labeled cure. Sometimes they'd prescribe potions with ingredients like ground-up pearls or unicorn horn. Yes, really, which were about as effective as a TikTok wellness trend. Meanwhile, Henry's court was a pressure cooker of flattery and fear. Everyone was performing all the time. Courtiers had to smile while dodging his temper tantrums, which were legendary. One minute he's laughing and slapping you on the back. The next he's sending you to the tower because you looked at him funny. This wasn't just stressful for his subjects, it was stressful for Henry. The man was constantly on edge, suspicious of everyone, and for good reason. Half the court was probably plotting something. This paranoia didn't just make him unpleasant, it made him sick. Chronic stress messes with your immune system, your heart, your everything. Henry's body was a battlefield, and he was losing on all fronts. By the time he hit his 50s, Henry was a walking, or rather limping, disaster. His leg ulcers were so bad they could be smelled from rooms away. His weight made movement agony, but he refused to be carried or use a wheelchair. Instead, he was hoisted around by servants or propped up on custom-made chairs that groaned under his bulk. His heart was struggling, his blood pressure was probably through the roof, and his kidneys were waving a white flag. Yet, he kept eating, drinking, and raging like a man who thought he'd live forever. This wasn't just denial, it was defiance. Henry VIII wasn't going to let a little thing like mortality ruin his vibe. But mortality doesn't negotiate, especially not with a king who treated his body like a landfill. That's where we'll pause for now. Henry's halfway to his grave, and he's digging it with a golden spoon. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll dive into the gruesome details of his final years, the court's desperate attempts to keep him alive, and the absurd lengths they went to hide the fact that their king was a rotting mess. Trust me, it gets worse and weirder. Alright, let's dive back into the grotesque carnival that was Henry VIII's life, where every day was a new episode of How to Ruin Your Body While Wearing a Crown. By now, Henry's not just a king, he's a walking medical mystery, a man whose lifestyle is less royal privilege and more self-inflicted torture chamber. We left off with him limping through his 50s, his leg ulcers stinking up the palace, his waistline rivaling a siege tower, and his temper making everyone wish they'd called in sick to court. Part 2 takes us deeper into the final act of this Tudor tragedy. Think less glorious reign and more man versus his own terrible decisions. Picture Henry, now in his mid-50s by 1545, a hulking shadow of the golden boy who once dazzled Europe. His body's a battlefield, and he's losing spectacularly. Those leg ulcers? They're not just oozing, they're practically auditioning for their own horror novel. The stench is so bad that courtiers have to hold their breath or douse themselves in rosewater just to survive an audience with him. Servants are tasked with changing his bandages, a job so gruesome it probably came with hazard pay. The wounds are chronic, infected, and possibly tied to something as mundane as a blood clot, or as sinister as undiagnosed diabetes. And nobody knows for sure because Tudor doctors were about as useful as a horoscope in a hurricane. These ulcers aren't just painful, they're a constant reminder that Henry's body is giving up, even if his ego isn't. He's still barking orders, demanding feasts, and acting like he's got decades left, but every step is agony and every movement is a gamble. The king's mobility is shot. At over 300 pounds with a leg that's more wound than limb, getting around is a logistical nightmare. Enter the royal workaround, a custom-built chair, sort of a proto-wheelchair, that servants haul around like it's the world's heaviest Uber. This thing is no sleek mobility aid, it's a creaking, groaning contraption that screams, "I'm still king, but my knees have filed for divorce." Sometimes he's hoisted upstairs by burly attendants, a humiliating necessity for a man obsessed with projecting strength. Imagine the scene, a dozen sweaty servants straining under the weight of their monarch, while courtiers pretend not to notice the indignity. It's absurd, it's tragic, and it's peak Henry, refusing to admit defeat even as his body waves a white flag. Now, let's talk about the court's role in this slow-motion disaster. Henry's surrounded by people whose survival depends on keeping him happy, or at least alive. His physicians are in a constant state of panic, trying to balance their fear of his wrath with the fact that their treatments are, at best, guesswork. Bleeding him with leeches? Sure, why not? Slathering his leg with a paste of herbs and who knows what. Go for it. One doctor reportedly suggested cauterizing the ulcers with a hot iron because nothing says royal health care like branding your king like a prize cow. These guys aren't working with x-rays or antibiotics. They're working with superstition and a prayer that Henry doesn't execute them for failing to fix him. The court's solution? Keep the king distracted. If he's eating, drinking, or yelling at someone, maybe he won't notice his body's falling apart. So, the feasts keep coming, each one more extravagant than the last. A single banquet could feature 30 dishes, venison, lampreys, game pies, all swimming in grease and washed down with enough wine to sink a ship. Henry's not just eating, he's waging war on his digestive system. His kidneys, liver, and heart are probably holding emergency meetings, begging for a break, but Henry's too busy proving he's still the biggest man in the room, and the court enables him. They cheer his gluttony, refill his goblet, and pretend his groans of pain are just royal vigor. It's like watching a train wreck where everyone's too scared to pull the brakes. Let's not forget the psychological toll. Henry's paranoia is off the charts now. He's always been suspicious, comes with the crown, but by his 50s, it's next level. He's convinced everyone's out to get him. His wives, his advisors, his own kids. His obsession with a male heir has already cost him 3 wives and countless headaches, and now he's got Edward, a sickly boy who's barely out of diapers. The pressure to secure the Tudor dynasty is crushing, and it's not like he can Google stress management techniques. Instead, he lashes out. Courtiers are executed on a whim. Thomas Cromwell, one of his most loyal advisors, gets the axe in 1540 for reasons that boil down to Henry's in a mood. The court's a tightrope, and everyone's walking it blindfolded. This stress isn't just bad for morale, it's killing Henry. Chronic stress spikes your blood pressure, weakens your immune system, and makes your body hoard fat like it's preparing for Armageddon. Henry's heart is working overtime, pumping through a body clogged with the residue of 1,000 feasts. His blood pressure is probably high enough to launch a cannonball. And yet, he keeps pushing because admitting he's mortal would mean admitting he's not God's chosen king. Spoiler, he's not. God's not signing off on this mess. Let's zoom in on the medical side because it's a horror show. Tudor medicine is less science and more performance art. Henry's doctors are still clinging to the 4 humors theory, where your health depends on balancing blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Got a fever? Too much blood, slice a vein. Leg oozing? Must be bad humors. Slap on some mystery ointment. These treatments aren't just ineffective, they're dangerous. Bleeding a man who's already weak from infection is like draining the oil from a car that's already on fire. And the ointments? They're often laced with lead or mercury, which are great for poisoning you slowly. Henry's leg ulcers are probably teeming with bacteria, but antibiotics won't exist for another 400 years. Instead, his doctors are throwing everything at the wall. Herbal poultices, prayers, even amulets. One account suggests they tried therapeutic baths, which sounds nice until you realize it's just dunking him in warm water, mixed with whatever herbs they had lying around. The result? Henry's wounds get worse, his pain gets sharper, and his temper gets shorter. But it's not just a leg. Henry's got a laundry list of ailments that read like a medieval WebMD nightmare. Gout's a big one. Those rich foods and endless booze have turned his joints into battlegrounds. Gout's not just a twinge, it's excruciating, like your toes are staging a revolt. He's likely got early signs of diabetes, thanks to his sugar obsession and obesity. His heart's struggling under the strain of his weight and lifestyle. Think of it as a tired horse trying to pull a cart full of anvils. And let's not rule out kidney issues. All that alcohol and salt is turning his insides into a chemistry experiment, gone wrong. Modern historians speculate he might have had Cushing's syndrome, a hormonal disorder that explains his ballooning weight, mood swings, and weakened immune system. But back then, nobody had a clue. They just kept bleeding him and hoping for a miracle. The court's not just dealing with a sick king, they're dealing with a PR nightmare. Henry's supposed to be the embodiment of divine power, a living symbol of England's might. A king who can't walk, can't ride, and smells like a plague ward doesn't exactly scream God's anointed. So, the court gets creative. They drape him in furs and jewels to hide his bulk, prop him up on thrones to mask his immobility, and spread rumors about his robust health to keep the French and Spanish from getting any ideas. Courtiers are masters of spin, smiling through the stench and pretending their king's just resting his vigor. Meanwhile, the palace is a hotbed of gossip. Servants whisper about the king's foul humors. Ambassadors report back to their courts about his declining health, and everyone's wondering who will take the throne when the inevitable happens. Edward's too young, Mary's got her own baggage, and Elizabeth's barely on the radar. The succession's a mess, and Henry's too stubborn to plan for it properly. He's still acting like he'll live forever, issuing proclamations, planning wars, and eyeing new wives like he's got time to spare. Speaking of wives, let's talk about Catherine Parr, his 6th and final queen. By 1543, Henry's a wreck, but he's still got enough charm, or at least enough power, to snag a new bride. Catherine's no fool. She's a smart, educated woman who knows she's stepping into a lion's den. Her job? Keep Henry happy, dodge his tantrums, and maybe sneak in some religious reform while he's distracted. She's less a wife and more a nurse, soothing his ego while managing his pain. She's got to deal with his moods, his wounds, and the constant threat that one wrong move could land her in the tower. Imagine being married to a man whose leg smells like death and whose temper could end your life. Catherine's a survivor, navigating this nightmare with the grace of a tightrope walker. But even she can't stop the inevitable. Henry's body is shutting down, and no amount of love, fear, or flattery can change that. The court's in a delicate dance, keeping up appearances while preparing for the end. They're ordering more bandages, more wine, more everything, because stopping would mean admitting the king's mortal. And Henry? He's still roaring, still demanding, still believing he's the invincible monarch who'll outlast everyone. But his body's got other plans, and they're not pretty. We'll pause here, with Henry teetering on the edge of collapse, his court scrambling to keep the show going, and his health spiraling into a grotesque finale. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll see just how bad things get. Think pus, panic, and a king who's literally falling apart at the seams. It's grim, it's absurd, and it's coming up next. Here we go, plunging back into the festering soap opera of Henry VIII's final years, where the man who once ruled England like a lion is now a wheezing, waddling monument to his own bad choices. We're in the home stretch of 1546, and Henry's body is staging a full-on revolt, while his court scrambles to keep the illusion of a mighty king alive. This is part 3 of our grim, absurd dive into the Tudor king's downfall, not from an assassin's blade or a rival's plot, but from a lifestyle so excessive it makes a rock star's bender look like a health retreat. Buckle up, because it's about to get grosser, sadder, and somehow even more ridiculous. By now, Henry's 55, and calling him larger than life is both literal and ironic. His weight's pushing 350 pounds, maybe more, and his body's a medical disaster zone. Those leg ulcers we talked about? They're not just a problem, they're a full-blown crisis. The sores are open, infected, and oozing pus like they're competing for the title of most disgusting royal feature. The smell's so bad that even the most loyal courtiers are gagging behind their velvet sleeves. Servants tasked with dressing the wounds deserve medals, or at least a day off from the nightmare. These ulcers aren't healing, they're getting worse. Likely fueled by poor circulation, possible diabetes, or maybe just the sheer chaos of Henry's body breaking down under decades of abuse. Every bandage change is a horror show, and yet Henry insists on powering through, because nothing says divine right of kings like ignoring your own mortality. His mobility's gone from bad to catastrophic. The proto-wheelchair we mentioned last time, it's not cutting it anymore. Moving Henry is like relocating a small fortress. Servants hoist him with pulleys, cranes, or sheer desperation, their backs straining while they plaster on smiles to avoid his wrath. Stairs are the enemy, and palace architects are probably cursing their lack of foresight for not installing medieval elevators. Henry's custom thrones are reinforced to handle his bulk, but even those creak ominously as if whispering, "We're not paid enough for this." And yet, he refuses to be seen as weak. He's still dressed in furs and jewels, propped up like a grotesque mannequin, his face painted with the illusion of vigor while his body screams for mercy. The court's in full damage control mode, and it's a masterclass in denial. Henry's supposed to be England's unstoppable force, a king chosen by God to dominate Europe. A monarch who can't walk, smells like a plague pit, and groans with every movement doesn't exactly inspire confidence. So, the courtiers get creative. They spread stories of his robust health, claiming he's just resting or conserving his strength for some grand campaign that everyone knows he'll never lead. Ambassadors are fed carefully curated lies while servants are sworn to secrecy about the king's condition. The palace is a stage, and everyone's playing their part in the fiction that Henry still got it. Meanwhile, the gossip mill is churning. Servants whisper about the king's foul distemper, and foreign spies are sending coded letters home, reporting that England's monarch is one bad day away from keeling over. The succession looms like a storm cloud. Edward, Henry's only son, is a frail 9-year-old who looks like he'd rather be reading than ruling. Mary, his eldest daughter, is a devout Catholic in a court that's swinging Protestant, and Elizabeth's still a teenager with zero political clout. Henry's too stubborn, or too delirious, to sort out the mess, so the court's factions are already picking sides, plotting for power like vultures circling a dying beast. Let's talk about the food, because Henry's still eating like he's got a personal vendetta against his digestive system. The feasts haven't slowed down, even as his body begs for a break. Picture tables groaning under platters of roasted boar, venison, and fish, all slathered in sauces that could double as mortar. Sugar's still his kryptonite. Marzipan, candied fruits, and syrupy puddings are shoveled down with reckless abandon. This isn't just gluttony, it's defiance, a middle finger to the reaper knocking at his door. Every bite's a gamble, and Tudor food safety isn't helping. Meat's often half-rotten, preserved in enough salt to mummify a cow. Spices hide the decay, but they don't stop the bacteria. Food poisoning's a constant risk, and Henry's gut is probably staging daily protests. His kidneys and liver? They're on life support, drowning in alcohol and grease. Speaking of alcohol, Henry's drinking like he's trying to empty England's cellars before he goes. Wine, ale, mead, it's all flowing faster than the Thames, which, by the way, is basically an open sewer. Clean water's a myth, so booze is the default, and Henry's not sipping delicately. He's chugging like a man who thinks death's just a bad rumor. Chronic alcohol abuse is torching his organs. Liver damage, kidney strain, and probably a brain that's fuzzier than a court jester's wig. Combine that with his diet, and you've got a recipe for gout so bad it makes his toes feel like they're being crushed in a vice. Gout attacks are frequent now, leaving him bedridden and roaring in pain, which only makes his temper worse. And that temper, it's a weapon of mass destruction. Henry's always been volatile, but now he's a powder keg with a lit fuse. Pain, infection, and paranoia have turned him into a tyrant who'd make a dragon look cuddly. Courtiers tiptoe around him, knowing one wrong word could mean a trip to the scaffold. In 1546, he nearly sends Catherine Parr to the Tower for daring to argue theology with him. Catherine, the one wife who's managed to survive his moods and his stench. She escapes by groveling, but it's a reminder, nobody's safe. Henry's executing advisors left and right, sometimes for crimes as vague as displeasing the king. The court's a minefield, and everyone's sweating bullets. Let's not forget the doctors, those poor souls stuck between a rock and a rotting leg. Tudor medicine's still a clown show, with treatments that sound like they were invented by a drunk alchemist. They're still bleeding Henry, as if draining his blood will magically fix his ulcers or his gout. They're slathering his wounds with concoctions of herbs, lead, and God knows what, each one more useless than the last. One physician tries a healing salve made from ground pearls and saffron because nothing screams cure like throwing money at a wound. Another suggests astrology, claiming the stars are to blame for Henry's suffering. Spoiler, the stars don't care. The infections keep spreading, the pain keeps growing, and Henry's body is a ticking time bomb. Modern historians have a field day with this. Some think Henry had type 2 diabetes, which would explain the ulcers, the weight gain, and the mood swings. Others point to possible heart failure. His massive frame and high blood pressure are a perfect storm for a heart that's gasping for air. There's even talk of syphilis, the Renaissance's favorite party favor, though the evidence is shaky. Whatever the exact diagnosis, the symptoms are screaming. Obesity, chronic infections, gout, and a heart that's working harder than a peasant in harvest season. Tudor doctors don't have the tools or the knowledge to help, so they keep up the charade, prescribing prayers and potions while Henry's body crumbles. The court's not just hiding Henry's decline, they're hiding their own panic. England's at war with France and Scotland, and a weak king is a liability. Henry's still signing orders for campaigns, but he's barely able to sit up, let alone lead an army. His advisors are running the show, forging his signature when he's too weak to hold a quill. The treasury's bleeding from his lavish lifestyle and endless wars, and the court's starting to fracture. Nobles are picking teams. Some back Edward, others whisper about Mary or even a distant cousin. It's a powder keg, and Henry's too busy yelling at his doctors to notice. Catherine Parr's still in the thick of it, playing nurse, diplomat, and therapist to a king who's half tyrant, half invalid. She's reading to him, soothing his rages, and dodging his outbursts like a pro. She's also pushing for religious reform, which is a bold move when your husband's one bad mood away from signing your death warrant. Catherine's a saint, or at least a survivor, and her presence is probably the only thing keeping Henry from spiraling completely. But even she can't stop the clock. By late 1546, Henry's bedridden more often than not. His fevers are spiking, his breathing's labored, and his heart's barely keeping up. The court's whispering about the end, but nobody dares say it out loud. Henry's still issuing proclamations, still demanding feasts, still acting like he's got years left. But the truth is creeping in, and it's uglier than a Tudor sewer. His body's done, and no amount of royal bluster can change that. We'll stop here, with Henry on the brink, his court in chaos, and his body staging its final rebellion. Stay tuned for part 4, where we'll walk through the gruesome last days, the desperate cover-ups, and the absurd lengths England went to pretend their king wasn't a corpse in waiting. It's a finale that's equal parts tragic, grotesque, and bizarrely fitting for a man who lived like Henry VIII. Welcome back to the grim finale of Henry VIII's self-inflicted downfall, where the king who once strutted like a Renaissance rock star is now a wheezing, rotting relic, clinging to life while his court plays a desperate game of keep the king alive. It's early 1547, and Henry's 55 years of gluttony, rage, and sheer Tudor stubbornness are cashing in their final bill. This is part 4, the endgame of our sardonic slog through a lifestyle so catastrophic it makes a Greek tragedy look like a sitcom. We're talking deathbed drama, court conspiracies, and a kingdom holding its breath as their monarch wheezes his last. Get ready for a finale that's equal parts grotesque, absurd, and weirdly poetic for a man who lived like he was allergic to moderation. Picture Henry in January 1547, bedridden in his Whitehall palace, a hulking mass of pain and pride. His leg ulcers are a nightmare, oozing pus and stench so vile that even the most devoted servants are praying for a breeze. The infections have spread, likely septic, turning his body into a battlefield where bacteria are winning. His weight, north of 350 pounds, makes every breath a struggle. His heart's a battered engine, chugging through a body clogged with decades of grease, sugar, and wine. Fevers rack him, his breathing's a labored rasp, and his skin's probably clammy enough to make a physician flinch. Yet, Henry's still issuing orders, still demanding to be treated like the invincible king he thinks he is. His mind's slipping, though. Delirium's creeping in, and the man who once commanded Europe is now arguing with shadows. The court's in full panic mode, but nobody dares admit the king's dying. In Tudor England, saying the king's not looking so hot is a one-way ticket to the Tower. Treason laws are brutal, and even hinting at the king's mortality could get you stretched on the rack. So, the courtiers keep up the charade, draping Henry in velvet, propping him up for brief audiences, and swearing he's just resting. Servants burn incense to mask the smell, while doctors apply useless salves, think ground-up herbs, and maybe a sprinkle of wishful thinking. One account claims they tried a poultice of precious oils and gold dust because nothing says cure like throwing jewelry at an infection. The reality? Henry's body is shutting down, and no amount of royal bluster can stop it. His doctors are terrified, stuck in a lose-lose situation. If they fail to save him, they're dead. If they suggest he's beyond saving, they're also dead. So, they keep up the routine, bleeding him despite his weakness, dosing him with mercury-laced tonics that probably poison him faster, and muttering prayers when science, such as it is, fails. Tudor medicine's a circus of quackery, and Henry's the unwilling star. His symptoms scream heart failure, sepsis, or maybe kidney collapse, but his physicians are still debating humors, like it's a philosophy class. One bold doctor might have whispered about dropsy, edema, or fluid buildup, but without modern diagnostics, it's just a fancy guess. Whatever the cause, Henry's organs are throwing in the towel, and his body's a ticking clock. Catherine Parr, the sixth wife and resident saint, is still by his side, playing nurse, confidant, and human shield. She's reading to him, managing his moods and dodging his outbursts like a pro. Catherine's no stranger to danger. Henry nearly had her arrested last year for being too opinionated about religion. Now, she's soothing a dying tyrant, holding his hand while the court whispers about what comes next. She's got to be exhausted, balancing her own survival with the thankless task of keeping Henry calm. Imagine the stress. Your husband's a 350-pound time bomb with a temper, and you're stuck playing therapist while his leg festers like a medieval biohazard. The court's a snake pit of intrigue, and Henry's decline is blood in the water. Factions are forming, each betting on a different horse in the succession race. Edward, the 9-year-old heir, is the obvious choice, but he's a sickly kid who'd rather study than rule. Mary, the Catholic daughter, has supporters but also enemies in the increasingly Protestant court. Elizabeth's a wild card, too young and too sidelined to matter yet. Nobles like Edward Seymour and John Dudley are already maneuvering, ready to seize power the moment Henry croaks. The treasury's a mess. Henry's wars and feasts have drained it like a bad gambling habit, and England's enemies are circling. France and Scotland are watching, waiting for a weak boy king to exploit. The court's keeping up appearances, but it's chaos behind the velvet curtains. Henry's not oblivious, but he's too weak to do much about it. He's still signing documents, or at least someone's signing them for him. His signature's looking shakier, and rumors swirl that advisors are forging it to keep the government running. He's issuing proclamations like a plan to invade France, again, but it's all bluster. The man can't sit up, let alone lead an army. His mind's a mix of paranoia and denial, convinced he's still God's chosen king even as his body begs to differ. He's ranting about traitors, demanding loyalty, and occasionally weeping over his legacy, because even tyrants get sentimental when the end's near. By mid-January, Henry's barely conscious half the time. His fevers spike, his breathing's a death rattle, and his heart's giving up. The court's in lockdown, with guards posted to keep out prying eyes. Nobody's allowed to talk about the king's health, but the truth's leaking like his ulcers. Servants gossip, ambassadors send frantic letters, and the palace feels like a powder keg. On January 28, 1547, the end comes. Henry's final hours are a blur of pain, delirium, and fleeting clarity. Legend says he called for Archbishop Cranmer, his old ally, and whispered something about meeting God with a clear conscience. More likely, he was too far gone to say much. His last words, if they happened, were probably lost in a cough or a groan. At around 2 a.m., Henry VIII, the man who broke with Rome, married 6 times and ate his way to oblivion, dies. The official cause? Nobody knows. Heart failure, sepsis, kidney failure, or just his body saying, enough is enough. Modern guesses lean toward a mix of obesity-related heart disease and septicemia from those cursed leg ulcers. Tudor doctors didn't do autopsies, so the truth's buried with him. The court doesn't announce his death right away. For days, they keep it quiet, smuggling his body out of Whitehall like it's a state secret. Why? Because a dead king means chaos, and they need time to secure Edward's throne. They wrap Henry's corpse in lead and linen, hiding the stench and the bloat, and cart it off to Windsor for burial. The funeral's a grand affair, but it's hollow. Nobody's mourning the tyrant, just the stability he represented. His coffin, loaded with pomp, reportedly splits open en route, leaking fluids and proving that even in death, Henry's a mess. The story's hushed up, but it's a fitting end for a man whose life was one long, grotesque spectacle. Henry's legacy is a paradox. A king who reshaped England, broke the Catholic Church, and left a dynasty that had outlasted him, but also a man who destroyed himself with every bite, drink, and tantrum. His death wasn't murder or betrayal. It was the inevitable result of a lifestyle that treated his body like a punching bag. The feasts, the booze, the stress, the jousting accident, they all piled up, a slow-motion execution by excess. His court enabled him, his doctors failed him, and his ego betrayed him. Henry VIII didn't die because of his wives. He died because he lived like a king who thought he'd never die. And that's where our story ends, with a kingdom teetering, a boy king crowned, and a corpse that's finally free of its own royal madness. Thanks for joining me on this wild, disgusting ride through Henry's demise. If you love this dive into Tudor chaos, let me know in the comments what's the most absurd thing you learned about Henry's end. And stick around for more historical horror shows, because the past is never short on nightmares. Hey guys, imagine being so bad at your job that you lose your crown, your country, and oh yeah, your head. Welcome to the tragic comedy of Louis XVI, the king who didn't just fumble the throne, but kicked it into a guillotine-shaped dumpster fire. Taxes. Sure, they played a part, but Louis's fall was a masterclass in royal self-sabotage, a slow-motion catastrophe fueled by indecision, decadence, and a court that made reality TV look tame. Picture a world where bread's a luxury, your advisors are scheming behind your back, and your wife's spending habits could bankrupt a small nation. Ready for a wild, sarcastic ride through the French Revolution's chaos, where survival was a gamble and Louis bet on all the wrong horses? Let's dive into the mess that cost a king his throne and his life. Louis XVI wasn't born to be a villain. He was just a guy who got handed a crown in a country that was already a financial train wreck. Born in 1754, he was the shy, awkward grandson of Louis XV, a king who'd spent decades burning through France's cash on wars and mistresses. By the time Louis XVI took the throne in 1774 at age 19, France was a glittering powder keg, drowning in debt and simmering with resentment. The young king wasn't a tyrant in the classic sense. No maniacal laughter or evil mustache twirling here. He was more like that guy who shows up to a board meeting unprepared, hoping charm and good intentions will save the day. Spoiler, they didn't. Let's set the stage. France in the 1770s is a land of extremes. The aristocracy's living like every day's a Versailles rave, with silk gowns, powdered wigs, and enough gold leaf to make a rapper jealous. Meanwhile, the peasants, about 90% of the population, are scraping by, eating bread that's more sawdust than flour and paying taxes on literally everything, including salt. The system's called the Ancien Regime, a fancy term for rich people win, everyone else suffers. The monarchy's supposed to keep it all together, but Louis XVI, he's less a divine ruler and more deer in headlights. His heart's in the right place. He genuinely wants to fix things, but his spine's on permanent vacation. The economy's a disaster, and Louis's got no idea how to handle it. France's debt is a monster racked up from Louis XIV's wars like the 7 Years' War, which cost France its North American colonies and a fortune. By 1774, the treasury's bleeding, and Louis's advisors are like, "Don't worry, Your Majesty, just borrow more." Genius plan, right? Except borrowing's not free, and the interest payments are eating up half the budget. The court's still throwing banquets with 50-course meals while peasants are boiling grass for soup. Louis, bless his indecisive heart, wants to reform the tax system to make it fairer, but every time he tries, the nobles throw a tantrum. These are the guys who own half of France and pay zero taxes, because apparently being born fancy means you're allergic to contributing. Louis's first big move is to appoint Jacques Turgot, a reform-minded economist who's like, "Hey, maybe we should tax the rich and stop spending like we're printing gold." Sounds reasonable, right? Wrong. The nobles hate it, the clergy hate it, and even the queen, Marie Antoinette, more on her later, thinks it's a buzzkill. Turgot's out by 1776, sacked because Louis can't handle the backlash. This sets the tone for Louis's reign. Good intentions, zero follow-through, and a court that smells rebellion a mile away. Speaking of Marie Antoinette, let's talk about the queen who became a lightning rod for hate. She's 19 when she marries Louis, an Austrian princess with a flair for fashion and a knack for bad PR. The French already distrust her because she's foreign. Austria's the enemy after all. And she doesn't help her case by spending like a reality star with a new credit card. Her nickname, Madame Deficit, isn't just catchy, it's a warning. She's dropping fortunes on dresses, parties, and a miniature village at Versailles where she plays peasant like it's a theme park. Meanwhile, real peasants are starving, and the gossip mill's churning out stories about her diamond necklaces and secret lovers. Was she as bad as they said? Probably not. But in a country where bread's a luxury, her vibe screams, "Let them eat cake." Even if she never actually said it, Louis's no saint here either. He's not cheating or throwing wild parties, but he's got his own expensive hobbies. He loves hunting, clockmaking, and building ships, which sounds cute until you realize he's burning through cash on custom warships while France can't afford to pay its soldiers. The royal couple's spending is a middle finger to a country on the brink, and the people are noticing. By the late 1770s, pamphlets are circulating, mocking Louis as a bumbling cuckold and Marie as a spendthrift harlot. The press is brutal, and there's no X to fact-check it, just pure, unfiltered venom. Then comes the American Revolution, and Louis makes a decision that's both noble and catastrophic. He wants to stick it to Britain, France's old rival, so he bankrolls the American colonists fighting for independence. It's a bold move. France sends money, ships, and troops to help the Yankees win, and they do. By 1783, America's free and France gets a pat on the back. But the bill? Astronomical. The war costs France over $1 billion livres, doubling the national debt. Louis's advisors are like, "Victory," while the treasury's screaming, "We're broke." The interest on the loans is crushing, and guess who's not paying for it? The nobles. Guess who is? The peasants, through taxes that make their lives a daily grind of misery. Louis is starting to feel the heat, but he's not built for crisis management. He's shy, hates confrontation, and would rather tinker with locks than face his court scheming. His advisors are a mixed bag. Some are reformists, others are just looking out for number one. The nobles, meanwhile, are digging in their heels, refusing to pay taxes because tradition. The clergy's know better, hoarding wealth while preaching charity. Louis tries another reform with Jacques Necker, a Swiss banker who's like Turgot but with better PR. Necker publishes a budget in 1781, showing France's finances are a mess, but the nobles still won't budge. Necker's out by 1783, and Louis is back to square one, borrowing more and praying for a miracle. The real kicker? The weather. The 1780s bring brutal harvests, droughts, floods, and freezes that turn crops to dust. Bread prices skyrocket, and by 1788, a loaf costs more than a peasant's daily wage. Starvation's real, and riots are popping off in Paris and beyond. People aren't just hungry, they're furious. They see the king and queen living it up at Versailles while they're eating dirt. Louis tries to help. He cuts his own household budget and donates to charity, but it's a drop in the bucket. The people want systemic change, not royal pocket change. By 1788, France is a pressure cooker. The debt's unpayable, the harvests are failing, and the people are done with the Ancien Regime's nonsense. Louis' advisors suggest calling the Estates General, a dusty old assembly that hasn't met since 1614. It's a desperate move to get the nobles and clergy to agree to taxes, but it's also a Pandora's box. The Estates General represents the three estates, clergy, nobles, and commoners, and the commoners are ready to air their grievances. Louis doesn't see it coming, but he's just lit the fuse on the French Revolution. The meeting's set for May 1789, and it's a disaster waiting to happen. Louis thinks he's solving a budget crisis. Instead, he's handing the people a megaphone. The court's still partying, the peasants are starving, and the ideas of the Enlightenment, liberty, equality, all that jazz, are spreading like wildfire. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau aren't just writing books. They're inspiring a generation to question why a bumbling king and his fancy wife get to call the shots. Louis, meanwhile, is still tinkering with clocks, oblivious to the storm brewing outside his gilded bubble. That's where we'll pause, with France teetering on the edge of revolution and Louis XVI cluelessly holding the match. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll dive into the chaos of the Estates General, the rise of the angry mob, and the moment Louis realizes he's not just losing his throne, he's losing control. It's messy, it's absurd, and it's only getting worse. Alright, let's dive back into the spiraling catastrophe that was Louis XVI's reign, where the French Revolution starts cooking and our hapless king is about to get roasted. We left off in 1788, with France's economy in tatters, the peasants starving, and Louis cluelessly lighting the fuse by calling the Estates General. This is part 2 of our sarcastic romp through the chaos, where indecision, bad optics, and a mob with pitchforks turn a bad situation into a full-blown nightmare. Picture Louis still tinkering with his clocks while the country's ready to explode. It's 1789, and the stage is set for a revolution that'll make Versailles look like a house of cards in a windstorm. Let's go. The Estates General kicks off in May 1789, and it's a mess from the jump. Louis thinks this assembly, clergy, nobles, and commoners, will solve his budget crisis by agreeing to tax the rich. Spoiler, it's like asking a fox to guard the henhouse. The first estate, clergy, and second estate, nobles, are living large, tax-free, and not about to start paying their share. The third estate, representing the commoners, everyone from merchants to peasants, is fed up. They're 98% of the population, but get one vote against the other two estates, who always gang up to keep the status quo. It's rigged, and the commoners know it. They're armed with Enlightenment ideas, liberty, equality, Rousseau's greatest hits, and they're not here to beg for crumbs. Louis, ever the optimist, opens the meeting with a speech so bland it could have been written by a committee of accountants. He's like, please fix my budget, but don't change anything important. The third estate's like, nah, we're rewriting the whole system. They demand a fairer voting system, 1 vote per delegate, not per estate. Louis dithers, cause that's his brand. The nobles dig in, the clergy waffle, and the third estate says, fine, we'll do it ourselves. On June 20th, they'd lock themselves in an indoor tennis court, because Versailles has those, and swear the tennis court oath, vowing to write a new constitution. Louis's response? A shrug and a vague promise to look into it. Classic Louis, kicking the can down the road while the road's catching fire. Meanwhile, Paris is a powder keg. Bread prices are still insane. Think $20 for a loaf in today's money, and riots are breaking out. People aren't just hungry, they're radicalized. Pamphlets are flying, calling Louis a bumbling fool and Marie Antoinette a foreign leech. The Queen's still spending like she's allergic to thrift, and her latest scandal, the diamond necklace affair, doesn't help. Quick recap. A con artist tricked a jeweler into thinking Marie wanted a gaudy necklace, then stole it. Marie had nothing to do with it, but the headlines scream corruption. The people already hate her for her Austrian roots and her let them eat cake vibe. Again, she never said it, but truth doesn't matter when you're starving. Louis tries to calm things down by promising bread subsidies, but it's too little, too late. The mob's not buying his charity act. Back at the Estates General, things go from bad to worse. By July, the Third Estate declares itself the National Assembly, claiming they represent the people. Louis, still allergic to decisions, lets it slide, thinking he can negotiate later. Big mistake. On July 14th, 1789, the mob storms the Bastille, a fortress prison that's more symbol than stronghold. It's got like 7 prisoners, but it's loaded with gunpowder and the crowd wants it. The attack's a bloodbath, heads on pikes, chaos in the streets, and it's a wake-up call. The revolution's not just talk anymore, it's real, and it's armed. Louis hears about it and reportedly asks, "Is it a revolt?" His advisor replies, "No, sire, it's a revolution." Louis probably went back to his clocks, hoping it'd all blow over. It doesn't. The Bastille's fall sends shockwaves. Across France, peasants start looting noble estates, burning tax records, and chasing landlords out of town. It's the Great Fear, a wave of panic and rebellion fueled by hunger and rumors of noble conspiracies. Louis, holed up in Versailles, finally realizes he's in trouble. He agrees to some reforms, abolishing feudal privileges, taxing the nobles, but it's like putting a band-aid on a severed limb. The National Assembly's rolling, drafting a constitution and declaring the rights of man and of the citizen, a document that sounds great but terrifies the aristocracy. Louis caught between the mob and the nobles, and he's got the spine of a jellyfish. He waffles, approving reforms one day, then backtracking when the nobles whine. Marie Antoinette's no help, urging him to stand firm while her own reputation tanks. By October, the mob's had enough. Thousands of women, market women, fishwives, the real MVPs of rage, march on Versailles, armed with knives, pikes, and pure fury. They're starving, their kids are starving, and they blame the royal couple. The women's march on Versailles is a game changer. They storm the palace, demanding bread and the king's head, or at least his attention. Louis, probably sweating through his silk, agrees to move to Paris, where the mob can keep an eye on him. The royal family's dragged to the Tuileries Palace, a dusty old place that's more prison than palace. It's a humiliation, but Louis thinks he can still play king. Spoiler, he can't. The revolution's picking up speed, and Louis's not driving. He's a passenger, and a bad one at that. In Paris, the royal family's under house arrest, surrounded by guards who are more revolutionary than royalist. Louis is still technically king, but the National Assembly's calling the shots. They're pushing for a constitutional monarchy, where Louis would be a figurehead with zero real power. He's not thrilled, but he signs off, thinking he can bide his time. Marie Antoinette's writing letters to her Austrian family, begging for help, which only fuels rumors that she's plotting with foreign powers. The court's a ghost town. Nobles are fleeing France, called émigrés, and taking their wealth with them. The economy's worse than ever, and Louis stuck in a city that hates him. Then comes his dumbest move yet, the flight to Varennes. In June 1791, Louis and Marie decide to ditch Paris and head for the Austrian border, hoping to rally loyal troops and crush the revolution. It's a plan so bad it's almost performance art. They disguise themselves as servants, Louis in a fake beard, Marie as a governess, and pile into a clunky coach with their kids. The plan's a mess from the start. They're recognized at a checkpoint, thanks to Louis's face being on every coin in France. The coach is stopped in Varennes, and the royal family's hauled back to Paris like runaway teens. The mob's livid, chanting "traitor" as Louis slinks back to the Tuileries. The flight to Varennes is a PR disaster. It proves Louis can't be trusted, and the Republicans, guys who want no king at all, gain traction. The Assembly keeps him on as a figurehead, but he's a king in name only. The radicals, like Robespierre and Danton, are preaching revolution, and the mob's listening. Louis still got some supporters, royalists who think he's God's chosen, but they're outnumbered. France is splitting into factions, moderates who want a constitutional monarchy, or radicals who want a republic, and nobles who just want their old privileges back. Louis, stuck in the middle, can't pick a side. He's still signing papers, still acting kingly, but it's all a charade. The real power's in the streets, where the sans-culottes, working-class radicals in pants, not fancy breeches, are ready to burn it all down. By 1792, things get uglier. France declares war on Austria, partly because the revolutionaries want to spread their ideals, partly because they think it'll distract the mob. Bad call. The war goes poorly, and the people blame Louis, accusing him of colluding with the enemy. In August, the mob storms the Tuileries, slaughtering the Swiss guards and forcing Louis to seek refuge with the Assembly. He's suspended as king, locked up in the Temple prison with his family, and stripped of all power. The monarchy's effectively dead, and Louis is just a guy in a cell, wondering where it all went wrong. That's where we'll hit pause, with Louis in prison, the revolution in overdrive, and France hurtling toward a republic. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll dive into the trial that seals his fate, the guillotine's sharp debut, and the absurd tragedy of a king who lost everything, not just because of taxes, but because he couldn't keep up with a world that was done. With kings, it's grim, it's chaotic, and it's coming up next. Buckle up, because we're diving back into the chaotic whirlpool of Louis XVI's downfall, where the French Revolution shifts from angry mobs to outright bloodlust. We left off in 1792 with Louis locked up in the Temple prison, his crown reduced to a cruel joke, and France sprinting toward a republic. This is part 3 of our snarky trek through the collapse of a king who lost his throne, not just to taxes, but to a lethal cocktail of bad decisions, worse timing, and a nation done with monarchy. Picture Louis, once the master of Versailles, now a prisoner in a gloomy fortress, while the guillotine sharpens its blade. It's grim, it's absurd, and it's about to get uglier. Let's roll. By August 1792, Louis XVI is no longer king in any meaningful sense. The Tuileries palace raid was a wake-up call. Hundreds of Swiss guards butchered, the royal family hustled into the Temple, a medieval prison that's less royal suite and more dank dungeon. Louis, Marie Antoinette, their kids, and a few loyal servants are crammed into cold, bare rooms, watched by guards who spit revolutionary slogans. The monarchy's been suspended, and the National Convention, a new radical assembly, has taken over. These guys aren't messing around. They're dominated by Jacobins, the hardline revolutionaries led by firebrands like Robespierre, Danton, and Marat, who think kings are as useful as a powdered wig in a hurricane. Louis is now Citizen Louis Capet, a humiliating demotion to the surname of his ancestors, as if he's just another guy who forgot to pay his taxes. The Temple's no picnic. The royals are under constant surveillance, their every move scrutinized. Louis tries to keep it together, reading Latin classics and teaching his son history, but it's hard to focus when you're hearing chants of "death to the king" outside. Marie Antoinette's hair is turning white from stress. She's only 37, but the revolution's aging her faster than a bad TikTok filter. Their daughter, Marie-Thérèse, and son, Louis-Charles, are stuck in this nightmare too, with the guards mocking them and food that's barely fit for rats. The family's only comfort is each other, but even that's fragile. Rumors swirl that the radicals might separate them. Outside, France is a mess. The war with Austria and Prussia is going south, with enemy armies closing in. The revolutionaries blame Louis, claiming he's colluding with foreign powers to crush the revolution. It's not entirely baseless. Marie Antoinette's been smuggling letters to her Austrian brother, begging for an invasion to save them. These letters, if discovered, are dynamite, and the radicals are already sniffing around. The economy's still a disaster, with bread prices so high people are eating rumors for breakfast. The sans-culottes, those pants-wearing radicals, are calling for blood, and the National Convention's listening. On September 2nd, 1792, things take a darker turn with the September massacres. Paranoid about counter-revolutionary plots, mobs storm Paris's prisons and slaughter over 1,000 prisoners. Nobles, priests, even random thieves, hacking them apart with pikes and knives. It's a preview of the chaos to come, and Louis, locked in the temple, hears the screams. He's not just a prisoner, he's a scapegoat for every grievance France has, from empty stomachs to lost battles. The National Convention, now running the show, declares France a republic on September 22nd, 1792. The monarchy's officially dead, and Louis is just a guy in a cell, waiting for the axe to fall, literally. The radicals, especially the Jacobins, want him gone for good. They dig through his papers and find a bombshell, the Armoire de Fer, a secret safe in the Tuileries stuffed with Louis's correspondence. It's got letters showing he was undermining the revolution, vetoing reforms, and cozying up to foreign powers. Jackpot for the prosecution. By December, the convention decides to put Louis on trial for treason. This isn't a trial in the innocent until proven guilty sense. It's a show, a public execution in slow motion. The trial begins in December 1792, and it's a farce wrapped in a tragedy. Louis is hauled before the convention, a room full of 700 deputies who've already made up their minds. He's charged with treason, conspiring with foreign enemies, and subverting the revolution. The evidence is damning. Those letters from the Armoire, plus his flight to Varennes, paint him as a traitor who'd rather sell out France than lose his crown. Louis, pale and haggard, tries to defend himself. He's got lawyers, but they're outmatched, and he's no orator. His defense boils down to, "I was just trying to do my job," which doesn't land well when your job was being king of a sinking ship. The deputies aren't here for nuance, they want blood. The trial's a circus, with Robespierre arguing that Louis's mere existence is a threat to the Republic. "You cannot reign innocently," he says, which is less a legal argument and more a death sentence with extra flair. The vote's a nail-biter, but not really. On January 15th, 1793, the convention finds Louis guilty, 691 to 0. The real question is the punishment. Some moderates, like the Girondins, push for exile or imprisonment, arguing that killing a king sets a dangerous precedent. The radicals, led by the Jacobins, aren't having it. They want his head, and the sans-culottes outside are chanting for it. On January 17th, the deputies vote on death, and it's close. 361 for execution, 360 for other penalties. One vote, that's all it takes to seal Louis's fate. The guillotine's waiting, and it's not just a machine, it's the revolution's new mascot, a shiny blade that promises equality in death. Louis is stoic, but you can bet he's terrified. He's allowed a final meeting with his family on January 20th, and it's gut-wrenching. Marie Antoinette's sobbing, the kids are clinging to him, and Louis is trying to keep it together while promising they'll be fine. Spoiler, they won't. He's led back to his cell, where he spends his last night praying with a priest and writing a will that nobody will care about. The morning of January 21st, 1793, dawns cold and gray. Louis is taken to the Place de la Révolution, now Place de la Concorde, where a crowd of thousands waits to see history's sharpest haircut. He's dressed plainly, no royal robes, just a simple coat. The guillotine looms, a 12-foot contraption that's more efficient than any executioner's axe. Louis tries to speak, declaring his innocence and forgiving his enemies, but the drums drown him out, a final insult. He's strapped to the plank, the blade falls, and at 10:22 a.m., Louis XVI is no more. The crowd roars, some dip handkerchiefs in his blood, and his head is held up like a trophy. France's monarchy is dead, and the Republic's born in blood. But the story's not over. Marie Antoinette's still in the temple, facing her own trial, and the revolution's about to get even crazier. The radicals are in charge, and they're not stopping at one king. The reign of terror is coming, a bloodbath where the guillotine works overtime, and nobody's safe. Not nobles, not revolutionaries, not even the guys running the show. Louis's death doesn't fix France's problems, it just pours fuel on the fire. The war's still raging, the economy's still a wreck, and the people are still hungry. The Republic's a dream, but it's a messy one, and Louis's execution is just the opening act. We'll pause here, with Louis's head in a basket and France plunging into chaos. Stay tuned for part 4, where we'll dive into Marie Antoinette's fate, the terror's bloody rampage, and the fallout of a revolution that ate its own king. It's tragic, it's insane, and it's the perfect end to a story about a man who lost everything because he couldn't or wouldn't change. See you next time for the gruesome finale. Here we go, plunging into the bloody, chaotic finale of Louis XVI's downfall, where the French Revolution devours its own and the guillotine becomes France's most overworked employee. We left off with Louis's head rolling in January 1793, the monarchy dead, and the republic born in a splatter of royal blood. This is part 4 of our snarky dive into the collapse of a king who didn't just lose his throne to taxes, but to a perfect storms of indecision, decadence, and a nation that decided kings were out of fashion. Now we turn to Marie Antoinette's grim fate, the reign of terror's body count, and the fallout of a revolution that chewed up everyone in its path. Picture a France where nobody's safe, not the queen, not the revolutionaries, not even the guy sharpening the blade. It's messy, it's absurd, and it's the perfect end to Louis's tragic comedy. Let's finish this. After Louis's execution, Marie Antoinette is left in the Temple prison, a widow at 37, her hair white, her kids traumatized, and her future looking bleaker than a Parisian winter. The National Convention, now run by Jacobin radicals like Robespierre and Saint-Just, isn't done spilling blood. Marie's not just a grieving queen. She's a symbol of everything the revolution hates. Foreign, extravagant, and aristocratic to her core. The sans-culottes, those pants-wearing firebrands, are screaming for her head, and the convention's happy to oblige. In August 1793, she's moved from the Temple to the Conciergerie, a damp, rat-infested prison dubbed the antechamber of the guillotine. Her conditions are brutal: tiny cell, constant surveillance, and food that makes Temple slop look gourmet. She's separated from her kids, which breaks her. Her daughter, Marie-Thérèse, is the only one who will survive this nightmare. But for now, they're all pawns in a deadly game. Marie's trial in October 1793 is a kangaroo court on steroids. The charges? Treason, conspiring with Austria, and, get this, incest with her 8-year-old son, a sick lie cooked up to inflame the mob. The evidence is flimsy: those smuggled letters to Austria, some forged documents, and a whole lot of gossip about her spending. Marie fights back, denying the incest charge with such dignity that even the mob hesitates, but it's a done deal. On October 16th, she's found guilty, sentenced to death, and the guillotine's booked for the next morning. Unlike Louis, she gets no tearful family goodbye, just a night to write a letter to her sister-in-law, begging her to care for the kids. At 4 a.m., she's shorn of her hair, dressed in a plain white gown, and carted to the Place de la Révolution. The crowd's vicious, jeering Madame Deficit as she keeps her chin up. At 12:15 p.m., the blade drops, and Marie Antoinette, the queen who never quite got France, joins her husband in the afterlife. Her head's paraded on a pike, because apparently that's just Tuesday in revolutionary Paris. The royal kids are left in the Temple, and it's a horror show. Louis Charles, the young Dauphin, is subjected to psychological torture, forced to drink, taught to curse his parents, and brainwashed into testifying against his mother. He dies in 1795, likely from tuberculosis or abuse, at age 10. Marie-Thérèse survives, exiled to Austria in 1795, but she's scarred for life. The royal family's destruction is complete, a grim reminder that revolutions don't spare the innocent. Meanwhile, the revolution's eating itself. The Reign of Terror, kicking into high gear in 1793, is Robespierre's masterpiece, a paranoid purge where the guillotine works overtime. Anyone remotely suspicious, nobles, moderates, even revolutionaries, gets a date with Madame Guillotine. By mid-1794, thousands are dead, maybe 40,000 in total, their heads piling up faster than the National Convention can count. The economy's still a wreck, with inflation so bad that paper money's used as wallpaper. The war's dragging on, and France's enemies are licking their chops, hoping to carve up the Republic. Robespierre, the guy who sent Louis to the chop, becomes the terror's poster boy, preaching virtue while signing death warrants. But even he's not safe. By July 1794, his allies turn on him, sick of the bloodshed and his sanctimonious rants. He's arrested, guillotined without trial, and the crowd cheers just as loud as they did for Louis. Irony's a harsh mistress. The terror winds down after Robespierre's fall, but France is still a mess. The Directory, a shaky new government, takes over in 1795, trying to stabilize things. It's less bloody but still corrupt, and the people are exhausted, starving, broke, and wondering if chopping off heads was worth it. Louis's death didn't fix the economy or feed the hungry. It just traded one chaos for another. The Republic stumbles along, but by 1799, a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte stages a coup, setting himself up as first consul and eventually emperor. So much for no more kings. Louis's legacy is a paradox. A well-meaning guy who wanted to reform France but couldn't stand up to his nobles, his wife, or his own indecision. His fall wasn't just about taxes. It was about a system so rotten it collapsed under its own weight. The Ancien Regime was a house of cards, and Louis was too weak to hold it up. His support for the American Revolution bankrupted France. His flight to Varennes proved he couldn't be trusted, and his inability to pick a side, reform or reaction, left him dangling in the wind. Marie Antoinette's extravagance didn't help, but she was more scapegoat than mastermind. The real culprits? A rigged system, a starving populace, and a king who thought he could tinker his way out of a revolution. France paid a price for its republic: blood, chaos, and a new dictator in Napoleon. Louis XVI's story is a cautionary tale about what happens when you're handed power you're not ready for, in a world that's ready to explode. He wasn't evil, just painfully human, awkward, indecisive, and stuck in a job he didn't want. His death didn't end the revolution, it just lit the fuse for more madness. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild, bloody ride through the French Revolution. If you love this dive into Louis's catastrophic fall, drop a comment. What's the most insane thing you learned about this mess? And stay tuned for more historical train wrecks, because the past is a goldmine of glorious disasters. Hey guys, ever wondered how an army of knightly legends didn't crumble on the battlefield, but melted under the weight of whispered secrets and courtroom dramas? Picture the mighty Knights Templar, feared by Saracens and crowned kings alike, only to be undone by scandalous rumors swirling through smoky Parisian salons. 10 seconds later, you'll never look at medieval history the same way. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. They say iron sharpens iron, but rumor sharpens reputations faster than any sword. In the late 13th century, the Templars rode across the Holy Land like avenging angels, their snowy mantles stained crimson with victory. They built fortresses, brokered treaties, even minted their own coins. Success, however, breeds envy, and envy is a hungry beast. By 1307, the same continent that cheered their victories would gasp in horror as unthinkable allegations surfaced: heresy, sodomy, devil worship. The Templars were about to be tried not on the field of battle, but in the stuffy halls of Avignon and Paris. Imagine a grand prior, guys call him Jacques, whisked from his candlelit chapel to a dungeon cell cold enough to freeze a camel's nose hair. He's marched before a tribunal where the judges already read the script. Perhaps you think medieval courts were a hotbed of debate? Well, they loved a good confession, especially if coerced. Under pricking needles and whispered promises of mercy, even the bravest knights cracked. "I saw the cross transform into a rooster," sobbed one nobleman. "The love between brothers, beyond friendship," cried another, trembling before hooded inquisitors. Confessions flew like autumn leaves in a gale, each admission more lurid than the last. Indeed, the first part of our story is a symphony of absurdity. We have allegations that Templars spat on the cross, obscene enough to curl a cardinal's toes. Yet historians today debate whether those accusations were even uttered in open court or whispered after too many glasses of Bordeaux. But back then, a man condemned on hearsay was a man bent on the rack. The scene evokes a Monty Python skit with a devilish twist. Torture instruments gleaming like broken promises, judges scribbling verdicts before dinner, and the accused too weary to remember which sin they'd actually committed. Now let's zoom out. King Philip IV of France, nicknamed the Fair for his aesthetics, not his morals, wasn't exactly broke. Yet rumors insist his coffers were emptier than a monk's vows after one too many pints. The king coveted the Templar treasury, rumored to rival the Vatican's own vaults. Why not seize the day? The plot thickens when you realize Philip had previously loaned vast sums to the order. It's the medieval equivalent of a bad credit card balance. Rather than negotiating, or heaven forbid repaying, he called in his army of clerics to cook up charges. It was fiscal policy, French style. If you can't pay your debts, you'll pay with your reputation instead. Meanwhile, Pope Clement V watched from his papal palace in Avignon, more enthralled by Provençal vineyards than by knights' confessions. He danced on a diplomatic tightrope, torn between protecting the church's mightiest soldiers and placating an angry monarch. His solution? Delay, defer, and diplomatically drag out the proceedings, until Philip lost his patience and arrested the entire order on a single chilly October dawn. Over 5,000 Templars across France were dragged from their beds, roughed up, and locked away. It was a 13th century version of a citywide raid, only with more crosses and fewer stormtroopers. Let's not forget the irony. These men had perjured themselves across continents to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, yet they now faced trial for crimes they likely never dreamed of committing. They'd spent decades defending the innocent. Now the innocent among them suffered by perjury's blade. At one Parisian prison, stories tell of Brother Arnaud de Carcassonne, famed for his piety, confessing under duress to anything the inquisitors demanded. His words, scrawled in trembling ink, would become the keystone of a case built on sand. He named fellow brothers, recounted midnight orgies that smelled more of vinegar than wine, and cursed the cross he once adored. As autumn leaves turned to frost, the judicial farce spilled beyond France. Templar strongholds across Europe awaited their fate. In England, where knights enjoyed a bit more legal courtesy, the Templars were interrogated but largely released. No proof, no prison. In Portugal and Spain, they merged with other orders or simply hung on to their lands. Yet the order's core in Paris withered, like a candle flickering in a wind tunnel. The Pope, ever the procrastinator, finally disbanded the entire brotherhood in 1312 at the Council of Vienne, like canceling a reality show after one scandal too many. The verdict: dissolve the order, redistribute modest assets to the Hospitallers, and pretend none of it was shocking. But that wasn't the end. The story pirouettes from dissolution to legend. Some Templars escaped to Scotland, where they allegedly aided Robert the Bruce and seeded the myth of Freemasonry. Others holed up in Cyprus, islands chasing shadows of former grandeur. Across Europe, common folk gossiped of hidden vaults brimming with gold. Treasure hunters centuries later would dredge every crypt and castle, hoping to unearth the order's secret riches, only to find dusty bones and faded seals. The real treasure was never gold, but the myth itself, a testament to how scandal can outlive steel. Yet amid all these yarns, a darker note resonates: the human cost. Hundreds of nights languished in cells so damp the air tasted of mildew and despair. Some flung themselves from towers rather than face perpetual torment. Priors who once commanded legions died begging for water in solitary confinement. The very symbols of honor and faith became tools of ignominy. Their white mantles, once beacons of charity, ended dust-stained relics in oubliettes. What survives in history books is often a footnote. Many perished under torture. But imagine the echoes, the last prayers whispered on frigid stone floors, the clatter of iron doors sealing final destinies, the silent tears of men betrayed by their sovereign and their God. The Templars' fall was not a clash of armies, but a collision of power, rumor, and greed. Their undoing reads like a cautionary tale scripted by cynics. Place too much trust in kings, and they'll gladly swap your crusader's spear for a trial's gavel. Entrust your fate to rumor, and you may find your reputation shredded in a public square. Their story reminds us that history's greatest battles often rage away from the clash of swords, fought instead in whispered corridors and ink-stained papers. As our first act closes, picture Paris in early 1310. Flocks of curious townsfolk gather near the Temple Church, craning necks to glimpse the accused. They'd once cheered Templars parading relics through crowded streets. Now they whisper of demonic rites and obscene rites. Children cling to mothers, half believing the tales, half expecting knights in shining armor to stride from the shadows and save the day. But no cavalry ride comes. Instead, torches flare as midnight interrogations begin, echoing chants in a disturbing lullaby of accusation and dread. So here we stand at the precipice of scandal. staring down the barrel of greed's guillotine. Our knights are broken in spirit, but their legend is only beginning. Fasten your mental armor, because next we delve into the dark heart of the trials. The lurid confessions, the bloodied parchments, and the political chess played on the backs of broken men. Welcome to the nightmare. In part 2, we uncover just how far rumor can travel when the powerful wield it like a weapon. The second act opens amid a swirl of parchment and betrayal. As dawn broke over Paris in the winter of 1311, the temple precincts resembled a macabre fairground. Scribes in ink-stained robes darted between cells to copy each new confession, while ecclesiastical envoys arrived clutching missives from Rome. Under flickering torchlight, Templars huddled together in their fetid cells, trading rumors of who would break next. Some quivered at the mention of the strappato, an especially creative form of medieval suspension torture, while others clung to whispered promises that full confessions might grant them respite, however fleeting. It was here that Brother Geoffroy de Charnay took the stand in his own mind, rehearsing his denial like a prayer. He had fought at Acre, nearly succumbed to dysentery in Cyprus, and tasted dust in the siege of Damietta, but nothing in his storied career prepared him for this. Summoned to the makeshift tribunal in the great hall of the Hôtel de Sens, he faced a cadre of judges whose faces were half hidden by the shadows of their cowls. "Do you reject the heresies charged against you?" intoned the presiding inquisitor, voice hollow as a tomb. Geoffroy's throat tightened. He knew full well that stoic refusal often led to the rack. Trembling, he managed a resolute, "I do," though his mind reeled. Would that single word cost him everything? Meanwhile, ink dried on another confession, this one penned by a certain Brother Amaury de la Roche. Amaury, keen of mind but brittle of spirit, had already named 20 fellow knights as co-conspirators in a midnight ritual involving secret kisses and inverted crosses. Now he detailed further blasphemies, mock baptisms with rancid oil, oath-swapping beneath crucifixes smeared with ash. His confession was a tapestry of extravagance so colorful it would shame any troubadour's love song. Yet historians later suggested Amaury had been fed an interrogation manual that read more like a litany of sins than any actual procedure. Torture, after all, is not about discovering truth, it is about crafting it. Outside, King Philip IV tightened his grip. Despite his kingly moniker, the Fair, he was anything but charming in matters of state finance. Rumor has it he despised interest rates as much as heretics, and by December 1311 his treasury still groaned under the burden of war debts. Each candlelit confession that named a Templar's supposed crime brought him closer to the gold vault beneath the temple church. He dispatched envoys to neighboring monarchs, urging them to mirror his inquisitions for the good of Christendom, he declared, though every mortal knew his motives had more to do with double-entry bookkeeping than divine justice. In Avignon, Pope Clement V attempted a diplomatic pirouette worthy of a dancer. He was caught between a rock-solid king with armies at his disposal and an order swaddled in papal bulls of protection. To complicate matters, whispers circulated that Clement himself owed Philip favors, a tangled web of loyalties more complicated than any Templar knot. The Pope issued decretals calling for moderation and fairness, even as his legates pressed for harsher sentences. This deferral tactic, ostensibly aimed at thorough investigation, only prolonged the agony for the accused and enabled Philip to seize more properties under the guise of safeguarding them until rightful ownership could be determined. By early 1312, the crimes catalogued against the Templars formed a grotesque mosaic. Each confession, whether whispered under the clang of torture or recited amid sympathetic courtiers, added a brick to the scaffold. The charges ranged from the obscene, allegations of kiss the base of the neck, the navel, and the testicles of the brother before you, to the fantastic, claims that the Templar initiation ceremony involved defiling the cross itself, stamping on it, until the wood splintered. It was an inquisition of absurd extremes, proving that, when power meets paranoia, imagination provides the most effective ammunition. Meanwhile, back in the dank Parisian cells, the human toll mounted. Brother Hugues de Perrot, once lauded as the order's finest tactician, refused to confess, despite 4 days of suspended weight on his arms behind his back. His gaunt face and hollow eyes betrayed a man hanging by nerve endings. When at last he spoke, it was a single word: truth. This cryptic utterance, delivered with lungs near collapse, only enraged his captors, who demanded specifics. Hugues' unwavering loyalty to his brothers was now the very crime for which he was punished. He lapsed into delirium, mumbling prayers in Provençal until he perished, alone in a cell unfit for animals. The monks assigned to witness these proceedings did their duty with unwavering dogmatism. They transcribed every allegation as fact, seldom pausing to question the veracity. Blood-spattered parchments piled high in monastic scriptoria, testifying to hours of grim procedure. One scribe, known only as Brother Luke, later confessed that he began to doubt the order's guilt when one night, shaking under torture, recanted his initial confession, only to be spurred by his tormentor to remember properly. This cycle of confession, recantation, and reconfession played out like a perverse theater of cruelty. Yet the grand farce continued. In Avignon, rumors that the Pope intended to commute sentences for those who repented circulated among listeners who had no idea repentance was meaningless without a genuine crime to atone. Some Templars capitulated, signing endless apologies and begging for absolution from sins they never named. Others, like the legendary Grand Master Jacques de Molay, stood defiantly silent until the allure of survival proved too great. Alone in a cell that reeked of excrement and despair, de Molay finally inked a confession admitting to faults against the rule and improper acts. His submission sent shockwaves. If even the Grand Master could be broken, who remained innocent? The political chessboard shifted yet again when Clement V announced at the Council of Vienne in May 1312 that the order would be suppressed. It was a decision less about justice and more about survival. Papal survival, that is. By dissolving the Templars, he hoped to placate Philip and curb further seizures of church property. The Pope spared no words. The order had fallen, not by sword, but by scandal. Yet he issued a decree forbidding the execution of any Templar who simply refused to admit guilt. This gesture of mercy rang hollow to those who had already died under torture. With the order officially disbanded, its vast holdings were supposed to transfer to the Hospitallers. In practice, many properties were seized outright by local lords or the crown. Castles once echoing with the steady chant of vespers lay empty, gates unbarred, laden with dusty armor and abandoned reliquaries. In France, Philip's officials auctioned off Templar estates to fill royal coffers, as though liquidating a defunct company's assets in the stock exchange of Paris. The Hospitallers received some lands, but precious few. In England, resistance from King Edward II, who refused to hand over seized Templar assets, left the Hospitallers scratching parchment while courtiers thumbed gold coins. In the wake of suppression, stories of surviving Templars spread like wildfire. One tale told of a band of knights who escaped the temple's dungeons by disguising themselves as laborers, slipping through a smuggler's tunnel beneath the Seine. Another claimed that the Grand Master emerged from captivity on a winter's night, leading a secret brotherhood hidden beneath the cobbled streets of Paris. These legends, though fanciful, pointed to one undeniable truth: scandal breeds mythology. And so, the Templar name was resurrected in whispered conspiracies, Masonic rituals, and alchemical texts promising keys to everlasting life. Yet for every rumor of secret vaults, there were countless personal tragedies. A chronicler recorded how a Templar chaplain, having lost faith in both God and king, wandered the roads of Provence, offering last rites to any wounded stranger he encountered, seeking penance for sins he claimed he never committed. In Constantinople, a handful of displaced brothers joined the Byzantine army, their white mantles repurposed beneath imperial banners. A few sailed off to Armenia, where they became mercenaries for petty princes, their former vows supplanted by a need for food and coin. By the end of 1313, only a handful of high-profile trials remained. In Marseille, a Templar commander named Hugues de Jouy, rumored to have bribed his way to exile, gave a public speech denying all accusations, invoking the memory of fallen brothers. Historians later burnt his speeches as unreliable sources. Few believed him. In Cyprus, surviving Templars quietly disbanded, selling their horses and arms to Venetian merchants. Their legacy lives on in the ruins of their castles, Lair, Beauquic, Chateau Pellerin, silent stone witnesses to a grandeur undone by intrigue. As part 2 draws to a close, we find ourselves amid the smoldering aftermath of trial and tribulation. The Knights Templar lie dissolved upon the altar of expedience, their testimonies burned, their lands scattered. Yet from these ashes rose a host of enduring questions. Were the charges rooted in truth, or merely convenient tools of royal finance? How many knights actually engaged in blasphemy, and how many were innocent men bent by threat and torture? The real horror lies less in the alleged sins than in the readiness of the powerful to believe and to weaponize rumor. In our next chapter, we'll journey beyond France, to the courts of England, Portugal, and the distant Levant, uncovering how the Templars' remnants navigated exile, adapted to new masters, and seeded legends that survive to this day. We'll meet the few who stood steadfast in loyalty, those who recanted to avoid death, and those who vanished into the night, leaving behind only whispered memories and half-told tales. Prepare yourself for tales of secret councils, hidden treasures, and the relentless pursuit of a brotherhood that refused to die quietly. The nightmare is far from over. The third act opens in the winter of 1313, when the surviving fragments of the order found themselves scattered like breadcrumbs in a gust. Our first stop is England, where King Edward II, bless his stubborn heart, had no appetite for Philip's financial machinations. While French bailiffs auctioned off swords and stables, English sheriffs stood bored, watching Templar properties gather dust. At Lincoln in London, former Templar preceptories were locked but unransomed, their iron-bound doors creaking in the wind, as if sighing for the echo of chanting brothers long gone. Inside one snow-dusted hall, Sir William de la More, once a proud banneret of the Temple, now paced by the hearth, boots scuffing frozen mud tracked in by his one remaining squire. William's battle wounds had healed poorly. His legs still ached whenever frost bit the earth. He peered into the embers as if expecting them to whisper counsel. Should he join the Hospitallers, a rival order equally steeped in legend but with fewer burning questions? Or should he seek passage to the Baltic, where the Teutonic Knights offered mercenary work to any sword arm with half a liver? Each option felt like a false promise, a feint in a duel that never truly happened. Meanwhile, rumors swirled through London's taverns that William and a handful of former Templars held clandestine meetings in the crypt beneath the Temple Church. Some said they plotted to petition the Pope for a reprieve. Others whispered of secret missions to rescue Grandmaster Jacques de Molay, presumed dead, but perhaps merely sleeping in a dank dungeon somewhere on the Seine. The idea of resurrection appealed to the English imagination, a final crusade to liberate the leader of the most infamous order in Christendom. But as William's squire pointed out, "Mate, the French seem to have cancelled all your heroes. Unless you fancy storming every dungeon between here and Aquitaine, you might as well toast your ghosts with this ale." Crossing the Pyrenees brings us to Aragon and Catalonia, where the Iberian Peninsula faced its own brand of opportunism. King James II of Aragon, half philosopher, half warlord, looked upon Templar castles like Cova Negra and Miravet as prized game pieces. In one sweeping gesture, he absorbed several commanderies into his royal domain, rechristening them with pious new names and installing cronies who owed their loyalty and their incomes to his favor. The former masters of these fortresses, stripped of authority and annuities, wandered the streets of Barcelona under the uneasy protection of merchant guilds that tolerated squirely desperation for the right price. Among these dispossessed knights moved Father Rodrigo de Villalobos, a chaplain who once administered mass beneath the vaulted ceilings of Miravet. He carried in his pack a small reliquary said to contain a thorn from Christ's crown, an artifact he insisted would prove the Templars' sanctity if only he could deliver it to Rome. Rodrigo's journey resembled a tragicomic pilgrimage. He braved pirates on the Mediterranean, fell ill in Valencia, and survived a brigand's ambush by convincing the bandits he was on a divine mission. When he finally reached Avignon, the papal guards dismissed him as a begging pilgrim and demanded payment for entry. Rodrigo left with his reliquary intact, but his faith in bureaucracy thoroughly shattered. Further west, Portugal offered a warmer reception. King Dinis, known for his keen nose for Portugal's fine wines and also for forging alliances, welcomed Templars with open arms, so long as they swore fealty to the crown rather than to an abolished order. In effect, he privatized their properties under a new banner, the Order of Christ. Thus were the Templars reborn, with a slightly different logo, and an annual tax levied to the royal exchequer. Their knights traded snow-flecked cloaks for broidered tunics and set sail for the Azores, mapping islands for Portugal's expanding empire. Few mourned the loss of their old rule. The rule itself could be rewritten more conveniently with royal ink. The stage now shifts to the Levant, once the Templar's beating heart, now the husk of a dream. In Acre, where cannons and cannibalism had replaced creek and crosslet, a handful of battle-scarred brothers clung to the shattered ramparts of their old fortress. Their numbers had dwindled under Saracen assaults. Rumor had it that the Sultan's best archers could pick off the last white-cloaked knight from half a league away. Those who survived Philip's writ now risked arrows instead of racks. They planted olive trees and tended goats, hoping to one day reclaim a portion of the Holy Land. It was a strange twist. The guardians of pilgrims became shepherds, guardians of goats, a pastoral consolation for glory lost. Yet among these exiled Templars rose whispers of a secret conclave. They wrote letters, ink smeared with olive oil, to counterparts in Cyprus and Rhodes, urging them to convene under a black moon. The objective was as grand as it was impossible: resurrect the order under a new charter, pledging to fight heresy wherever it flared. This clandestine network adopted signs and passwords by which they might recognize each other: a palm pressed to the heart, a sudden cough at dawn, or the cryptic phrase, "Have you tasted the vine?" Survival meant subterfuge, fidelity meant denial. The conspirators discovered that in the shadows of history, myth is as potent as steel. They spun stories of lost treasure hidden beneath the Temple Mount, gilded chalices buried amid the rubble of Solomon's temple. They swore that the brass plates and sacred oils they carried would sanctify any army bold enough to reclaim Jerusalem. But each time they reached the point of action, they found themselves betrayed by a missing horse, a bribe-wary captain, or the intolerable weight of age and regret. A half-forgotten dream of crusade faltered against the desperate reality of exile surviving one day at a time. Back in Europe, a darker legend took shape in the corridors of power: the idea of the Templar Bank. Yes, dear viewer, while our knights fought in distant deserts, they pioneered a proto-banking system. Pilgrims deposited valuables in Abruzzo, withdrew funds in Acre, a medieval money market unparalleled in sophistication. When the order dissolved, countless nobles found their savings vanished or confiscated. Estates that once thrived under Templar fiscal deftness now lay bankrupt, demoted from princely comfort to peasant poverty. A French countess accused her chamberlain of embezzling her fortune by switching her letters of credit. The chamberlain fled to Flanders, where he changed his name to something less suspicious and became a brewer. The echoes of financial scandal reached papal ears. In a rare moment of transparency, Clement V commissioned an audit. Imagine a medieval IRS crawling through chests of gold florins and ingots of silver. Auditors arrived in populated towns like Cyprus and Sicily, demanding ledgers balanced. When they uncovered discrepancies, missing entries, suspicious loans to absent commanders, their findings were quietly shelved. No one wanted to admit the church's top soldiers had turned vaults into vaulting lies. Instead, a handful of accountants vanished into monasteries, their clacking abacuses silenced forever. Our narrative now pivots to the realm of legend and rumor, where the Templars' true immortality resides. In Scotland, story has it that the king, Robert the Bruce, that cunning rebel, received the loyalties of surviving Templars in exchange for sanctuary. He granted them lands in Kildrummy and Falkland, and in return, they introduced Scottish nobles to the secret handshake that would become Freemasonry. Whether these tales hold truth or they're simply Scotch whiskey talking is a debate for historians, perched in dimly lit libraries. But consider the symbolism. A once secret society re-emerging centuries later, swathed in secrecy and ceremony, yet championing ideals of brotherhood and charity, ironically echoing the very rule that condemned its progenitors. Across the Channel in Germany, wandering Templars inspired Gothic ballads. Minstrels sang of a knight named Wilhelm von Teufel, who, after breaking his vows, donned secular garb and wandered into the Black Forest. There, he discovered an emerald spring said to grant visions of the end times. Drinking greedily, he foresaw the collapse of every kingdom, the rise of a new era governed by mercy rather than might. He carved runes on ancient oak doors, marking the paths for future pilgrims. Though historians scoff at the story, pilgrims still trek to the spring, hoping to glimpse Wilhelm's ruins, and perhaps to sip a drop of prophetic water. In Italy, the Templars' stones found new purpose in monasteries and palazzi. Gothic arches were dismantled, columns repurposed for cloisters where Franciscan friars chanted, unaware their acoustics owed themselves to an order accused of heresy. Noble families boasted of Templar blood in their veins, an ancestral claim that conferred prestige without consequence. Yet in the shadowed courtyards of Florence, artists sketched secrets into frescoes, stylized crosses inverted, hidden M's formed by the arches of angels' wings, a silent wink at those who knew the subtext. As this third act reaches its midpoint, we confront the most enduring paradox, how an order erased by decree could survive in the human psyche more vividly than most institutions that thrived in life. The Templars became the darlings of conspiracy theorists, the muses of novelists, and the punchline of comedians who delight in medieval absurdity. They were accused of devil worship and then deified as guardians of secret knowledge. Their trials, once limited to Parisian dungeons, now play out on global stages, from Hollywood epics to online forums speculating about hidden crypts beneath Vatican City. Yet beneath the mythology lay a profound human tragedy. Brothers who had sworn fealty to Christ and to each other died alone, unnamed in the garbled records of tortured confessions. Their names, their voices, barely survived the razing of the temple in 1314, the final act in medieval France's horror show. It was said that when Jacques de Molay emerged to face the flames, he cursed both Philip and Clement, a vow of vengeance so theatrical that chroniclers preserved it as gospel. Whether those words carried power beyond drama is open to interpretation, but they cemented the image of the Templar martyr, blazing defiance even as his life flickered out. By 1315, the last embers of organized resistance had died, but the fire in people's imaginations burned hotter than ever. Secret societies claimed lineage, amateur treasure hunters dug under moonlight, and poets invoked Templar paradoxes to critique contemporary politics. Better the scaffold than the scheming court, they quilled, drawing on the Templars' fate as allegory for any institution ensnared by power. As Part 3 draws to a close, our scattered knights have become specters haunting Europe's collective dream. From English crypts to Portuguese archipelagos, from Levantine olive groves to the misty highlands of Scotland, their legacy morphs with each retelling, sometimes saintly, sometimes devilish, always provocative. What remains constant is their unintended mastery of myth-making, for in the end, the greatest power a fallen order can wield is the power to transcend its own demise. In our final chapter, we will weave these disparate threads into a tapestry, examining how modern institutions, banks, churches, even governments, echo the Templars' triumphs and catastrophes. We'll explore the lessons learned or ignored about rumor, power, and justice, and why 7 centuries later we still whisper their name when conspiracy calls, or when we question the price of blind allegiance. The curtain is primed to fall on this saga, but first, one last plunge into the abyss where history and legend collide. Stay with us. The final act opens with a question that has echoed through centuries. What becomes of an order when its stones crumble but its stories refuse to die? Across Europe and beyond, the Templar ghost remained a living presence, in vaults and vaulting lies, in whispered conspiracies and grand designs, in the very fabric of institutions that rose from their ashes. As we draw our journey to a close, consider how the Templars' demise by scandal instead of sword laid a blueprint for power, struggle still playing out today. We begin in the marbled halls of Renaissance Florence, where the Medici Bank, then the envy of Europe, adopted many of the Templars' financial innovations. Letters of credit, bills of exchange, guarded couriers. These were the same tools that had once allowed a pilgrim in Naples to draw funds an acre. Yet whereas the Templars operated under monastic vows, the Medici answered only to profit, and occasionally to the papal purse strings they managed. It's said that when the Medici faced accusations of manipulating church offices, they appealed to the Templars' precedent. If knights could be accused without proof, why not bankers? The lesson was clear. Rumor and ledger entries, when wielded properly, can topple dynasties far more efficiently than a lance. In the south of France, the legacy took a more mystical turn. Occult circles, and later the Rosicrucians, claimed Templar initiations as their forebears. Secret handshakes, veiled rites, keys to hidden knowledge. Alchemists pored over Templar seals, convinced the symbols contained ciphers to the Philosopher's Stone. Defeat by scandal, they mused, becomes triumph if scandal births secret wisdom. In dusty manuscripts, they drew a direct line from the 1314 autos da fe to their own whispered rituals. The fire that killed de Molay did not destroy his enlightenment, it spread it underground. Meanwhile, in the burgeoning nation-states of the 17th and 18th centuries, governments studied the Templar collapse with interest. England's glorious revolution of 1688 saw Parliament curtail the king's power. Pamphleteers compared James II's overreach to Philip the Fair, and warned that unchecked monarchy could end in witch hunts rather than wise rule. In America, the Founding Fathers invoked Templar lessons when drafting a constitution that balanced power and protected due process. Trial by jury, habeas corpus, separation of powers. Each principle emerged as a shield against the kind of arbitrary prosecution that consigned knights to the rack. They may not have mentioned Templars by name, but the specter of medieval abuse hovered over every debate. As the Industrial Revolution roared to life, corporations adopted Templar tactics without a moral hesitation. Boards of directors learned that controlling information could suffocate dissent. When whistleblowers arose, corporate lawyers drafted non-disclosure agreements, modern-day papal bulls, binding employees in secrecy or ruin. If a knight could be forced to swear on false testimony, a clerk could be coerced by the threat of financial ruin. The echo of the rack now resonated in the boardroom. Confess to compliance or face the gavel of litigation. Yet the most astonishing revival occurred in wartime intelligence. During World War II, British and American planners studied the Templars' network of preceptories, their encrypted communications, and their mobility across borders. Resistance cells in occupied Europe adopted similar cell structures, small, autonomous, sworn to secrecy. The Templar motto, non nobis domine, not unto us, O Lord, was repurposed as an ideal of selfless solidarity, and one wonders whether psychologists noted the order's fracture when rumor supplanted unity. It became a cautionary whisper. Cohesion demands truth, and without it, even the staunchest brotherhood can crumble. Meanwhile, popular culture surged with Templar imagery. Alexandre Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo, 1844, dramatized the injustice of wrongful imprisonment, an explicit nod to Templar trials, and fueled a fervor for vindication narratives. Dickens, Hugo, and later Dan Brown tapped into the same vein. Conspiracies hidden in plain sight, trials of innocence, redemption through secret knowledge. The Templars became a cultural shorthand for any institution accused of wrongdoing. From the Vatican to Wall Street, from Silicon Valley to shadow governments, Templar-like insinuations carried immediate emotional weight. Accusations became clickbait, and in that lies the most modern of scandals. Truth's value now measured in audience retention rather than justice. But let us not reduce this to mere metaphor. In 2009, in a small country courtroom in Spain, the trial of a finance minister accused of corruption evoked medieval parallels. Defense lawyers quoted the Templars' plight, convicted on hearsay and tortured into confession, and demanded that evidence be constrained to material proof. The presiding judge, seemingly flattered by the historical allusion, ruled to exclude statements obtained under coercion. The minister walked free, and commentators lauded the decision as a nod to justice born in the shadow of the temple. Whether the analogy was apt matters less than its power to shape modern legal norms. Yet for every triumph of due process, the Templar shadow darkens another corner. Online rumor mills. In the 21st century, cancel culture mirrors the medieval rush to judgment. Viral accusations on social media can topple careers before any investigation begins. The digital rack, a barrage of public shaming, extracts confessions or coerces silence. In one notorious case, a university professor resigned after anonymous tweets alleged misconduct. Weeks later, evidence emerged clearing him, but the damage was done. Like the Templars, accused in a frenzy of accusation, victims of modern scandals find whispers amplified into roars that drown truth. In this sense, the Templars' ultimate legacy is a warning. When rumor becomes weapon, justice bleeds out. Their story teaches two intertwined lessons. First, institutions that promise protection, be they monastic orders, governments, or corporations, can become oppressors if honesty is sacrificed for expedience. Second, the human capacity for myth-making means that reputations, once sullied, are rarely fully restored. A single poisoned arrow of accusation leaves a wound that time seldom heals. And yet, beneath the cynicism, there lies a spark of resilience. Across history, individuals have resisted rumor's tyranny. In France today, legal reforms enshrine the right to be presumed innocent, inspired in part by historical cases, from Joan of Arc to the Templars. In England, charity ombudsmen mediate disputes to prevent defamation. In the US, the Supreme Court has ruled that public figures must prove actual malice before winning defamation suits, an echo of medieval fears of false judgment. These are not mere legislative footnotes, they are living memorials to victims of power's abuses. In the world of art and scholarship, too, the Templar story finds redemption. Historians sift through Vatican archives and read parchments hidden for centuries, disentangling coerced confessions from genuine dissent. Documentaries juxtapose grainy trial transcripts with expert analysis, restoring nuance to events once caricatured by propaganda. Museums reconstruct the daily life of a Templar brother, his meager rations, his tools, his scriptorium, revealing a humanity obscured by scandal. Through such efforts, the knight's voices, once drowned by torture and intrigue, echo anew, urging us to discern truth in a sea of sensationalism. Yet what of the order's spiritual legacy? Here, perhaps, lies the subtlest, most paradoxical triumph. The Templars, born to defend pilgrims and protect relics, embraced a rule of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their fall, brought about not by battles lost but by their entanglement with power, highlights the fragility of ideals when filtered through human ambition. Modern movements inspired by Templar ethos, charitable organizations, interfaith foundations, even open-source communities, strive to recapture that original zeal without succumbing to the lust for control. They draft charters with transparency clauses, establish independent oversight boards, and publish audited reports, all safeguards against the scandal that felled the medieval knights. In popular imagination, the Templar name now evokes both the allure of secrecy and the perils of unchecked authority. Video games let players don the mantle, to feel the weight of that white cloak and the twin edges of courage and hubris. Blockbuster films depict de Molay's last curse as a prelude to apocalyptic conspiracies. An amusing exaggeration, perhaps, but one that underscores the deep imprint of this history on our collective psyche. The very absurdity of some legends, a secret inner circle guiding world events, speaks to our distrust of power and our yearning for meaning in chaotic times. By the time you pause this video, you'll have traversed 7 centuries of scandal, myth, and transformation. But what remains when the echoes die? The scandal that felled the Templars was not a singular event. It was a process, repeated wherever power and secrecy collide. Their story invites us to ask, at what cost do we safeguard our institutions? How do we balance the need for security with the imperative of transparency? And crucially, how do we, as individuals, resist the tide of rumor that threatens to erode trust? So, dear viewer, we arrive at our destination, the crossroads of history and memory. The Knights Templar stand as a monument to both human ambition and human frailty. They remind us that even the most sanctified orders are susceptible to scandal, and that the true measure of justice lies not in the ferocity of our accusers, but in the courage of our defenders. Whether you find them in stone ruins under moonlit Paris or in footnotes of legal reforms that protect your rights, the Templars endure as a testament to the enduring struggle between rumor and reason, power and principle, image and reality, and perhaps that, above all, is their greatest legacy. Not the treasure that treasure hunters still seek in hidden vaults, but the lesson that every sword, no matter how gleaming, can be turned against its master when the blade of scandal is sharpened in silence. Let their story guide our vigilance, temper our judgments, and inspire our pursuit of truth, lest we too become prisoners of whispers in our own dark dungeons. 10 seconds ago, the sun was still rising over an empire on which the sun never set. Now, all you see is the glare off half-empty teacups and a tax collector's scowl. 15 seconds later, you'll learn why a nation built on naval supremacy and plundered coffers unraveled over a pot of tea and a few badly worded stamps. By the mid-18th century, the British Empire stretched from Bengal's monsoon-drenched ports to the windswept moors of Nova Scotia. Its ships rippled across every ocean, carrying spices, silks, and, most lucratively, tea. And why tea? Because nothing says civilization like a genteel hour devoted to infusing boiled water with dried leaves, and then taxing the hell out of it. In London's glittering coffee houses, fashionable ladies and gentlemen nibbled petit fours and pondered Enlightenment ideas. Meanwhile, ministers in powdered wigs debated whether taxing everyday indulgences was a brilliant way to fill the royal treasury, or a surefire recipe for rebellion. Spoiler alert, it was both. Our tale begins in 1764, when Britain's coffers were emptier than a magistrate's promise. The 7 Years' War had devoured gold and men alike, leaving the king's ministers clutching their ledgers in despair. Enter Charles Townshend, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and proud architect of what history would snarkily call the Townshend duties. With his trademark red waistcoat embroidered in fiscal optimism, Townshend slapped duties on paint, paper, glass, and, crucially, tea, aiming to squeeze every last pence from Britain's American colonies. His logic? The colonists should help pay for the empire's defense since their frontier outposts had fended off French forces. Simple enough, until the colonists realized they were being nickeled and dimed for essentials while lacking any say in Parliament. No taxation without representation, they cried, a slogan so catchy it spread faster than smallpox on a troop ship. Across the Atlantic, colonial merchants bristled. New York's bustling docks grew tense as tea chests sat unsold on the quays. Charleston's taverns erupted with debate. Should patriots burn the tea, boycott it, or simply drown it at sea? Philadelphia's artisans etched caricatures of King George III as a tax-hungry dragon. Boston, ever the revolution's tinderbox, saw its sons of liberty plot their most theatrical of protests, the Boston Tea Party. On a cold December night in 1773, dozens of hooded colonists boarded 3 East India Company vessels docked in Boston Harbor. With grim determination, and Tory grog to steel their nerves, they hurled 342 chests of tea into the icy water. That's nearly 90,000 pounds of leaves, and enough to fill the bottom of a modern freight container. The harbor turned an ironic shade of brown, and the world realized that tea could indeed drown an empire's diplomacy. In London, Lord North, the Prime Minister tasked with cleaning up the mess, faced a dilemma. Should he send more troops to subdue unruly colonials, risking further bloodshed and expense? Or should he repeal the taxes, admitting defeat before the revolution even truly began? North, ever the pragmatist, conceded on most duties but clung stubbornly to the tea tax, convinced it symbolized parliamentary authority. His decision backfired spectacularly. The colonists interpreted a partial repeal as weakness, and the retained tax as insult. Provincial legislatures called for continental congresses, militias formed in taverns, town criers bellowed calls to arms. Where once stood loyal colonial subjects, now marched embattled patriots, musket in hand, ready to defend liberties they claimed were theirs by birthright. Meanwhile, in England's own backyard, unrest flickered. Ireland, too, bristled under trade restrictions and heavy duties. Irish linen and cattle faced barriers while English wooleners prospered. Irish patriots saw in the American struggle a kindred cause. Dublin guilds refused to unload taxed British tea, and landlords found their rent checks mysteriously late. In Madras and Bombay, British East India Company officials watched nervously as local merchants threatened to redirect trade toward the French and Dutch, who offered lower levies. Everywhere, the empire's spokes creaked under the weight of discontent, all ignited by the simple question, who gets to decide the price of tea? Back in Westminster, satirical pamphlets lampooned the crisis. One broadsheet depicted Britannia, half naked and shivering, clutching a cracked teacup. Another showed colonial governors chained to London's treasury, demanding ransom payments in tea crates. Animated debates filled the House of Commons. When Edmund Burke rose to speak, he argued eloquently for conciliation, warning that the greatness of Britain can only be maintained by the voluntary loyalty of its subjects. His words, delivered with classical grace, fell on divided ears. Some MPs hailed the colonies as spoiled children who must be disciplined. Others warned that stubbornness would cost more in men and money than any renewed tax would raise. By 1775, the tinderbox ignited at Lexington and Concord. British regulars marched to seize colonial arms. fueling firefights that claimed the first blood of revolution. When word reached London, King George III reportedly said, "We must send more troops." And send he did. Tens of thousands of redcoats crossed the Atlantic, establishing blockades, besieging cities, and laying waste to fields of tobacco. But the colonists learned guerrilla tactics in dense New England forests, evading British volleys and striking supply lines. The bloody stalemate tested British resolve, eroding support at home. Portraits of young soldiers killed in skirmishes began to appear on mantelpieces in Liverpool. Mothers penned tearful letters to the king, pleading for peace. In 1777, the philosophical war of pamphlets turned into formal alliance. Benjamin Franklin, with his owl-like spectacles and disarming wit, charmed the French court. Louis XVI, eager to avenge losses from the 7 Years' War, signed treaties supplying guns, gold, and 6,000 soldiers in a single stroke. The British Empire, suddenly threatened by European powers on 2 continents, found its resources stretched to breaking. Caribbean sugar islands, vital to the royal treasury, came under threat as French and Spanish warships prowled the Atlantic. What began as a spat over tea had become a global conflagration. By 1781 at Yorktown, Cornwallis found his army trapped between French cannons and colonial riflemen. Surrender came not with a roar of muskets, but with a white flag raised in humbled defeat. Britain's greatest general, once celebrated in martial ballads, now trudged to his tent, his pride as battered as his troops. When news reached London, Prime Minister North fell from power, and Parliament stared at the yawning gap in its American empire. 13 colonies, once jewels in the crown, now gone. Yet the empire did not vanish overnight. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris formalized American independence, and Britain turned toward India, Australia, and Africa with renewed vigor. Administrators in Calcutta wrestled with local rulers. Settlers in New South Wales contended with unfamiliar bush and stubborn kangaroos. Merchants in Cape Town grandly declared, "We'll build an empire here." But trauma lingered. Tea taxes now reminded officials of hubris. Stamping every document with the royal seal felt like relitigating old wounds. Governors whispered of establishing colonial assemblies to placate restless settlers. Financiers cautioned against overextension. The lesson, etched in spilled tea and musketeers' blood, was that empires shrink when subjects drown in taxes they never agreed to. As the first act of this saga closes, picture a map of the world circa 1785. Britain's flag still waves over vast territories, yet the Atlantic coast glows a rebel shade of crimson. Ships continue to sail under the Union Jack, but their cargoes are lighter, no longer burdened by chests of East India tea commandeered from Boston Harbor. In Westminster's gilded halls, ministers study balance sheets stained with ink and tears, debating how to knit back together an empire rent by fiscal folly. Across the seas, new governors draft constitutions and recruit militias, determined not to repeat the mistakes that began with a simple question: how much for a cup of tea? Fasten your powdered wigs and steady your tea services. Next, we delve into the age of colonial reinvention, where Britain gambled on mercantile reforms, naval innovations, and social engineering to reclaim glory. Spoiler, some gambles paid off, others begat fresh troubles. But for now, take a breath after our first course of tears and taxes. Our imperial banquet has only just begun. They say empires are built on ambition and unbuilt by bureaucracy. After America slipped through the fingers of Whitehall, Britain faced a choice: drown in self-pity or engineer a new world order. Spoiler alert, they chose both. By 1786, the East India Company was Britain's golden goose, bruised but not broken. Lord Cornwallis, yes, the same general who surrendered at Yorktown, returned to India as Governor-General, determined to turn a humiliating defeat into administrative triumph. He found a land riven by rival princes, each vying for Mughal favor or French muskets. Cornwallis' response was an elegant blend of hypocrisy and efficiency. He proclaimed free trade while demanding crushing taxes from peasants, then used the revenue to bribe local nawabs into subsidiary alliances. "We protect you from your neighbors," he told them, for a small annual fee. Suddenly, British troops garrisoned palaces from Bengal to Bombay, not as conquerors but as guarantors of peace, though their cannon barrels spoke a louder peace treaty. Meanwhile, London financiers debated the merits of state versus private control. The East India Company, originally a trading venture, was transformed into a semi-governmental body. It minted coins, negotiated treaties, and even fielded warships. Critics likened it to Frankenstein's monster, a creature stitched together from charters and shareholder demands. Edmund Burke, ever the moralist, thundered in Parliament against a body of men unaccountable to any assembly of men. Yet when push came to shove, ministers backed the company. Its dividends lined gilded pockets, and its rule over 60 million souls gave Britain the veneer of an Asian empire without the fuss of colonial settlement. Back home, reformers gnashed their teeth over the India problem. Robert Peel proposed reorganizing the company's civil service, replacing patronage with meritocracy. His civil commissioners, sporting powdered wigs and Sanskrit primers, set about cataloging languages, religions, and customs so that every rapacious tax collector could claim cultural sensitivity. Simultaneously, British missionaries saw opportunity. Protestant zealots poured into the company's territories, distributing Bibles alongside blankets. Their moral fervor fueled a cultural clash. Colonial officers admired local art and architecture, while clergymen condemned it as heathen idolatry. The paradox of civilizing mission was on full display. British rule was benevolent so long as locals wore Victorian dress and praised Anglican hymns. In the Caribbean, too, Britain sought to reverse its fortunes. Sugar Islands had been the empire's cash cows, but planters groaned under competition from beet sugar presses on the continent. The solution? More coercion. Slave codes were tightened. Patrols roamed plantations to snuff out any hint of Muscovado-fueled revolt. In 1791, the Haitian Revolution erupted like a fuse in a powder magazine. Enslaved people, sick of being taxed with lashes, seized weapons and declared a republic. Britain dispatched troops to suppress the uprising, but yellow fever tore through redcoats as effectively as any slave uprising. By 1798, the British planter class realized that Caribbean sugar was too toxic, literally and politically, to merit the cost. They began to lobby for abolition, not out of conscience, but to cut losses. The philosophy of slave labor or no labor gave way to free labor or no sugar, marking one of the first cracks in the empire's moral facade. While sugar fortunes soured, the seas bristled with opportunity. The Royal Navy, Britain's steel-spined bulwark, underwent a transformation. Admiral Horatio Nelson's lightning victories at the Nile and Trafalgar in the 1790s secured command of the waves. With French invasion thwarted, Britain could refocus on colonial expansion. Ships roamed the Pacific, charting coastlines and dropping anchor at unclaimed atolls. Missionaries in Tahiti boasted of converting chiefs. Mahogany traders in Tasmania recounted ecstatic tales of bartering with natives. Yet each discovery carried the weight of dispossession. Indigenous peoples found themselves under a Union Jack before they had a chance to learn English, let alone complain. In India, the Maratha Wars of 1799 to 1818 further consolidated British dominion. 4 successive conflicts chipped away at Maratha power, culminating in the Treaty of Poona. The East India Company now ruled a sprawling dominion from Madras to Mumbai. Yet this crown jewel gleamed with ironies. British officers gorged on curry cooked by Indian servants, dined on silver platters engraved with Persian calligraphy, and admired Mughal miniatures, while enforcing laws forbidding locals from possessing firearms. The Raj was an elaborate masquerade. At its heart, it claimed to respect Indian customs even as it rewrote law codes, land tenure, and social hierarchies to suit British investors. Back in Britain, the Industrial Revolution surged like a sinful pleasure. Cotton mills in Manchester spat smoke into the sky. Rivers of coal powered steam engines that clattered like mechanical heartbeat. Factories demanded raw materials and markets, a perfect rationale for imperial reach. Indian cotton goods, once prized in Europe, now faced competition from machines reproducing muslin at 10 pence the yard. Bengal weavers, starved of demand, revolted in sporadic uprisings against British factories, only to be crushed by artillery. Thus, the empire that began as a trading post morphed into a supplier of raw materials and a market for British manufactures, a relentless cycle of wealth extraction disguised as progress. But imperial overreach breeds backlash. In 1706, an obscure cleric named William Wilberforce reanimated the abolitionist movement. His speeches, laced with scripture and statistics, portrayed the slave trade as a Christian stain. As the anti-slavery society gained traction, the government faced a choice: renew the ruthless trade that fattened planters' wallets, or uphold the moral rhetoric they so lavishly preached at home. By 1807, the Slave Trade Act outlawed the trade, but not slavery itself. Illicit slaving ships swerved fire across the Atlantic. Admiralty courts seized vessels laden with human cargo, flogged crews, and dumped liberated Africans onto settlements in Sierra Leone. The Crown asserted its moral authority, yet refused immediate emancipation in colonies, preferring a gradualist approach that placated reformers without bankrupting plantation owners. Elsewhere, the Peninsular War, 1808 to 1814, became an unexpected theater of colonial tension. Napoleon's invasion of Spain spilled into Portugal, forcing British armies to march through Iberian-fetid plains. Wellington's victories cheered London, but drained treasury and manpower. Soldiers returning from Spain carried stories of creaking Napoleonic bureaucracy, scorched earth villages, and Spanish guerrillas who fought for independence with a ferocity that shamed disciplined redcoats. The Spanish-American colonies watched closely. If Spain's mighty army could be evicted by French invaders aided by British boots, why couldn't colonial subjects in the Americas bid for self-rule under more favorable terms? The Peninsular experience spread a revolutionary contagion far beyond Iberia. Indeed, Spain's New World possessions trembled. Creole elites in Mexico, Peru, and Venezuela, emboldened by Iberian chaos, launched independence movements. Britain, smelling commercial opportunity, discreetly supplied arms and recognized new republics once they secured autonomy. Free trade evangelists argued that independent Latin American markets would blossom for British textiles and machinery. Thus, Britain inadvertently abetted the shrinkage of another European empire, even as it fortified its own. By 1825, most Spanish colonies had broken free, trading royal seals for British trade agreements. It was an imperial irony. Britain's gunboat diplomacy was more persuasive when fired from safe coasts, supporting rebels who cut the roots of other crowns. At home, the Reform Bill of 1832 signaled another shift. Industrial towns demanded representation. Rotten boroughs, tiny electorates easily bribed, were abolished. The tide of no representation without representation that began in America had circled back to the metropolis. As the franchise expanded, colonial policy came under sharper scrutiny. Newspapers published graphic accounts of Indian famines, millions starved while company coffers swelled. Public outrage forced the government to allocate relief, intervene in provincial revenues, and even sack errant officials. The Raj, once an exotic curiosity for London elites, became a matter of public accountability. The iron fist of indirect rule was supplemented by the velvet glove of parliamentary oversight. Meanwhile, the Anti-Corn Law League campaigned against protectionist tariffs on grain, arguing that cheap food would temper radicalism at home. Their victories in 1846 freed trade but undercut agricultural rents that funded local gentry, many of whom sat on colonial boards. The landed aristocracy, once the backbone of imperial enthusiasm, grew ambivalent. If Britain was to prosper on merchant shipping and manufacturing, why maintain a global garrison at vast expense? The cost-benefit ledger began to show red ink. Colonies required soldiers, governors, and railways, capital-intensive projects with uncertain returns. On the Indian subcontinent, the company's tilt toward profit over prudence provoked disaster. In 1857, sepoys, Indian soldiers trained and paid by the company, mutinied, citing rumors that their new rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, offending both Hindu and Muslim faiths. The Indian Mutiny, or India's first war of independence, depending on your perspective, erupted in Delhi and spread like wildfire. British officers and civilians were massacred, women and children huddled in besieged bungalows. It took months of brutal reconquest, aided by Sikh troops loyal to the crown, to quell the uprising. The rebellion's suppression was merciless. Villages razed, culprits executed en masse, and entire regiments disbanded. Parliament responded by abolishing the East India Company in 1858 and transferring direct rule to the crown, the birth of the British Raj. Viceroys replaced company governors, and India House in London became the nexus of imperial administration. Proponents boasted of civilizing initiatives, railways linking Bombay to Calcutta, telegraph lines humming faster than gossip, and schools teaching English grammar. Yet beneath the veneer, the structural inequalities remained. A tiny Anglo-Indian elite governed a teeming mass of disenfranchised subjects. The Raj was both a triumph of administrative engineering and a reminder that control can be tightened only so far before it chafes against the will of millions. By mid-century, the British Empire had contracted and rebounded, lost a continent, helped another continent break free, and reshaped Asia and Africa through corporate and crown. But new challenges loomed. The scramble for Africa began in earnest as diplomacy in Berlin carved up the dark continent among European powers. Britain claimed Egypt's Suez route, coveted South Africa's diamond mines, and eyed the Nile's source like a hawk. Yet African resistance, from the Zulu warriors at Isandlwana to the Mahdist uprising in Sudan, proved that the imperial map was drawn in ink but defended at the barrel's muzzle. As our second act closes, the empire stands larger in landmass than ever, yet more fragile at its seams. The machinery of rule, tax collectors, surveyors, resident commissioners, hums ceaselessly, but the engine groans under the weight of reform bills, revolts, and global competition. British soldiers straggle through monsoon jungles in Maxim's crossfire. Colonial clerks debate the merits of local customs versus English law. Back in London, financiers fidget as the stock prices of tea and cotton fluctuate by the evening bulletin. The question echoes through commons and coffeehouse alike. Can a modern empire, built on capitalism and coercion, sustain itself without losing its moral and financial compass? Fasten your pith helmets and oil your bayonets. Next we'll explore the apex and the fractures, the Victorian age of imperial confidence, followed by the fissures of nationalism, world wars, and the slow pivot from dominion to commonwealth. Our imperial banquet has served second course, the table's far from clear, and the final act promises both triumph and tragedy. At the dawn of the Victorian era, the British Empire reached its zenith, stretching from the sun-scorched sands of Egypt to the frigid wastes of Hudson Bay. Yet the pride of being the workshop of the world came bundled with new nightmares. Steamships roared across the seas, telegraphs hummed under oceans, and Queen Victoria's diamond crown glittered over half the globe. But for every marvel, railways carving through mountain passes, social reforms touted as proof of moral leadership, there lurked an imperial wobble, the uneasy alliance of profit and paternalism teetering on the brink of hubris. In the 1850s and 60s, India flourished under the Raj's ambitious, civilizing projects. The Grand Trunk Road was macadamized, the Ganges Canal diverted to irrigate parched fields, and universities sprung up to educate a class of English-speaking Indians. Colonial administrators boasted of building hospitals and stamping out barbaric practices. Yet behind sanitized statistics lay famines that claimed millions, crops rotted by global price fluctuations, relief efforts hamstrung by laissez-faire economics and bureaucratic inertia. Sir Charles Trevelyan, president of the Board of Control in London, declared it not desirable that the natives should be too comfortable, on the grounds that hardship bred industriousness. In practice, his apprenticeships and neglect turned entire districts into scenes of skeletal misery, and the censor's reports tried to hide the groans beneath columns of profit and loss ledgers. Meanwhile, in Africa, the scramble reached fever pitch. Diplomatic conferences at Berlin and Brussels carved up territories based on latitude lines and the personal ambitions of chancellors. British flags went up in Nigeria and the Gold Coast, followed by treaties, often signed by chiefs who couldn't read English, ceding sovereignty in exchange for trinkets and the promise of protection. Chartered companies like the Royal Niger Company grew fat on palm oil and rubber concessions, policing their domains with armed cadres that blurred the line between commerce and conquest. And in South Africa, Cecil Rhodes made his famous boast, "What a splendid country for a telegraph cable," while orchestrating wars against the Matabele and Zulu, convinced that British breech-loading rifles and Maxim guns were proof enough of racial destiny. At home, proud Britons devoured newspapers filled with dispatches from distant outposts, headlines about native uprisings alongside stock quotes for jute and gold shares. Missionary societies held charity bazaars. Clergymen preached that empire was a divine trust. Meanwhile, cartoons in Punch depicted colonial subjects as grateful children toiling happily under the Union Jack. Yet beneath the veneer of Victorian confidence, cracks formed. Liberal politicians questioned the morality of blood-covered expansion. Socialists pointed to inequality at home, slum housing, starvation wages in Manchester mills, and argued that imperial glory distracted from domestic misery. When unemployed cotton weavers protested in the streets of Huddersfield, their chants, "Why feed an empire when our bellies are empty?" hinted at a shift. The empire might serve the nation, but the nation was beginning to doubt the empire. The turn of the century brought fresh challenges: the Boer Wars in South Africa, where British soldiers faced Boer commandos adept at guerrilla tactics. The sieges of Ladysmith and Kimberley inspired patriotic fervor, but reports of concentration camps, where Boer civilians, including women and children, perished in appalling numbers, provoked an outcry. Emily Hobhouse's dispatches back home described tents filled with typhoid and malnutrition. Society pages that once gossiped about duchesses' tiaras now carried harrowing photos of skeletal children. Even the staunchest imperialists had to concede. Our methods were sometimes indistinguishable from the very tyranny we claimed to oppose. On the global stage, the Great Game in Central Asia pitted Britain against Russia for control of the fabled stands in Afghanistan's mountain passes. Cavalry columns and spy networks collided in deserts and oases, each empire planting flags in desert sands. When the British installed Emir of Afghanistan died, his successor's loyalty became the subject of midnight cablegrams between London and Calcutta. Here, too, the notion of civilized rule ran headlong into the reality of tribal loyalties and endless terrain. It was imperial micromanagement turned farce. Men in pith helmets arguing over the exact wording of a tribal treaty while Afghan clans simply shrugged and carved their own paths. Meanwhile, a new breed of nationalist stirrings emerged among the empire's subjects. In India, the Indian National Congress, formed in 1885, initially a gentlemen's club for Western-educated elites to petition the viceroy for modest reforms. Their debates, conducted in clipped English prose, seemed quaint to British officials. "Dear sirs, we humbly request greater representation." Yet beneath the polite veneer lay a growing impatience. Why plead politely when the default was to ignore? Across Africa and the Caribbean, crackling print communities, magazines, newspapers, political societies began to canvass ideas of self-rule. Among educated Jamaicans and Ghanaians, the notion of self-determination was no longer an abstract talk. It was a goal engraved on every diploma and circulation list. Back in the mother country, the political climate shifted. The Liberal government under Gladstone lamented that the jewel has become a burden, while conservative voices warned ominously of decline if we abandon our responsibilities. Debates in the Commons grew more fractious. Should Britain grant responsible government to settler colonies like Canada and Australia? The Dominion status granted after the Boer War, self-governing but bound to foreign policy, was a half-measure that pleased nobody fully. Yet, by 1907, with the establishment of the Union of South Africa under a white minority franchise, the empire had an awkward template. Colonies could govern themselves, but race and class determined whose voice counted. Then came the cataclysm of the First World War. As Europe tore itself apart, the empire rallied. Indian sepoys, African carriers, Australasian armies, Canadian corps sent millions of men into trench hell. They fought valiantly at Gallipoli, Ypres, and the Somme, forging bonds across continents but also magnifying contradictions. Indian soldiers returned asking, "Why defend your liberty in Europe when ours is restricted at home?" West Indian veterans pressed for equal rights after surviving mustard gas. Australian diggers who had vanquished the Kaiser's hordes bristled at being told to know their place by British governors. The war's human cost, over 1 million colonial soldiers dead, began to shade imperial pride with bitter irony. The empire's triumph depended on sacrifices that colonized peoples had never asked to make. In the post-war peace settlements, self-determination was proclaimed as a universal right. Wilsonian idealism that applied punishingly to defeated Germans and Ottomans, but seldom to India or Egypt. Instead, Britain carved mandates from the collapsed Ottoman Empire, ruling Iraq and Palestine under League of Nations auspices. The Balfour Declaration promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, a vague phrase that unleashed a century of conflict. In Iraq, British installed monarchs ruled over disparate ethnic groups with military garrisons for enforcement. The imperial experiment morphed into a trusteeship, justification for continued rule couched in language of guardianship, her rehabilitation, and civilization. But instead of ushering in progress, it stoked resentments. Iraqis who had fought in World War I found themselves under another distant mandate. Jewish settlers faced resistance from the Arab majority. Empire as babysitter was a prescription for breakdown. Throughout the 1920s, India's freedom movement accelerated. Gandhi's campaigns of nonviolent civil disobedience, boycotts of British cloth, salt marches defying excise taxes, delivered daily doses of embarrassment to colonial officials. Each arrest of a frail ascetic in white khadi clothing filled front pages, eliciting both sympathy and outrage back home. British newspapers that once portrayed Indians as childlike now debated the legitimacy of colonial rule in editorials. When the Chauri Chaura incident turned violent, the British justified crackdowns, but the genie of self-rule could not be resealed. Provincial elections, introduced reluctantly in 1935, produced Indian majorities and Indian leaders who refused to be mere advisory voices in a system designed to silence them. While India simmered, settler colonies moved toward full independence. Canada in 1867, Australia in 1901, New Zealand in 1907, and later South Africa, evolved into dominions that exercised real autonomy, choosing their own prime ministers and foreign policies. At the 1926 Imperial Conference, the Balfour Declaration on the Future of the Empire recognized that Great Britain and her dominions are autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal in status. It was the first crack in the facade of unity. The empire was increasingly a commonwealth of equals in name, though racial restrictions still marred many constitutions. The Great Depression struck a final blow to imperial confidence. Global trade plummeted and tariff walls rose everywhere. Britain's market shrank as its own industries suffered. Calls grew to reduce military expenditures on colonial garrisons and prioritize domestic relief. Politicians who had once boasted of managing empire now promised to manage unemployment at home. The logic was clear. If an empire couldn't pay for itself in good times, it was a luxury in bad times. Debates in the Commons, once dominated by dispatches from Bombay and Lagos, now fixated on dole queues in London and unemployment rates in Newcastle. By the eve of the Second World War, the British Empire had transformed from a monolithic superstructure into a patchwork quilt of self-governing dominions, restless colonies, and contested mandates. Its strength lay in global cohesion of flag and language. Its weakness lay in the divergent aspirations of peoples who demanded the right to choose their own futures. The apparatus of colonial administration, governors, governors general, resident commissioners, was vast but creaking, caught between the twilight of Victorian paternalism and the dawn of nationalist assertion. As our third act closes, imagine a globe in 1939. Dark belts of British rule cover swaths of Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Meanwhile, banners of nascent independence begin to flutter in towns from Bombay to Kingston. Across the channel, war drums beat once more, threatening to call the empire and its restless subjects into another crucible. Will the empire's military might withstand the storm? Or will the call of self-determination break the gilded cage of colonial rule? In our final chapter, we confront the most dramatic shrinkage yet, the tumult of global war, the surge of post-war decolonization, and the eventual transformation from empire to commonwealth. Strap in for the closing spectacle of collapse, reinvention, and the lingering echoes of an age when one nation convinced itself it could rule half the world. At the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939, the British Empire stood at a crossroads. Would it rally its far-flung dominions and colonies into a unified war machine, or would the strains of distance and clashing aspirations rip it apart? Within days, Indian and African recruits were shipped to British training camps. Canadian and Australian airmen took to the skies over France. New Zealand troops prepared to gird at Greece and Crete. Yet beneath this veneer of solidarity lay uneasy questions. Why were overseas subjects fighting for freedoms they themselves had been denied? Why did British ministers beg for Canadian wheat and Australian wool, even as propaganda posters reminded those producers that king and country need you? It was empire in its most paradoxical form, the promise of unity tempered by the reality of unequal partnership. In London's war cabinet, Winston Churchill, half poet, half bulldog, declared that the empire must fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields and streets, in the hills. We shall never surrender. His words galvanized Americans, Indians, Africans, and Antipodeans alike, yet they struck a hollow chord among colonized peoples. In 1940, when Britain braced for invasion and rationed sugar and tea at home, Indian nationalists demanded immediate self-government. Quit India rallies broke out, flags unfurled in provincial capitals, and Congress leaders were jailed en masse. Simultaneously, African leaders in the Gold Coast and Nigeria intensified demands for constitutional reform, arguing that wartime sacrifice deserved political reward. Colonial governors, strapped for resources, responded with a mix of concessions, limited legislative councils, and repression, banning nationalist gatherings. The empire's internal front would prove as volatile as any battlefield. Meanwhile, the war effort elevated the strategic value of imperial assets. The RAF needed Caribbean airfields to guard Atlantic convoys. The Royal Navy required Indian shipyards to repair destroyers, and the Middle East's oil fields under British mandate were declared vital to the war's outcome. Specialist engineers were flown into Basra, Aden, and Suez, where they connected pipelines and built refineries. In East Africa, British and Commonwealth troops pressed into Eritrea and Ethiopia, ousting Italian forces. Yet every investment in colonial infrastructure was a double-edged sword. Post-war, nationalist leaders would demand that railways, ports, and power plants be handed over to local governments, not returned to a London treasury already bankrupt from conflict. The turning point came in July 1941, when the Atlantic Charter, drafted by Churchill and Roosevelt aboard a battleship off Newfoundland, proclaimed the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live. To American ears, this sounded like a broadcast commitment to self-determination. To British ears, a call to preserve an informal British Commonwealth of Nations in lieu of direct rule. Colonial secretaries scrambled to craft new imperial rhetoric. We will bring freedom and prosperity to our subjects through partnership, not paternalism. Yet the wording betrayed the old mindset, freedom so long as it conformed to British interests. As the war turned in the Allies' favor by 1942 to 43, the empire's cracks became chasms. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 shattered illusions of white invulnerability. British troops and colonial auxiliary units surrendered en masse to Japanese forces, who promptly treated them and local civilians with brutal contempt. Survivors returned with stories of torture and indignities that eroded confidence in imperial protection. In India, the Japanese advance into Burma sparked the largest ever voluntary evacuation in history. Over 500,000 civilians fled southward, trudging through monsoon jungles. Indian soldiers muttered that if the British could not defend Asia, why should Asians continue to serve the British crown? Meanwhile, colonial office cables leaked hints of post-war plans. Social welfare reforms in Britain would be paid for by colonial revenues. Constitutional conferences would mollify elites while ignoring grassroots demands. In Guyana and Jamaica, labor unions struck for higher wages, arguing that wartime inflation had rendered their meager colonial salaries worthless. Strikes in railway workshops in Kenya, sugar mills in Mauritius, and tin mines in Malaya spread, forcing governors to negotiate wage deals that empowered trade unions and political parties. By the time the Axis powers surrendered in 1945, the empire had been transformed by the crucible of war. Military cooperation had forged bonds among diverse peoples, while the rhetoric of democracy stoked irresistible demands for political rights. The victors gathered at Potsdam and San Francisco, where war aims speeches extolled anti-fascist unity but skirted the subject of colonial empires. American leaders, smelling Khyber Pass oil and West African bauxite, quietly urged Britain to decolonize, proposing trusteeship arrangements under the new United Nations. Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman, pressed the British to honor the Atlantic Charter, reminding Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden that self-determination is not an empty phrase. Churchill, sidelined at Yalta and Potsdam, fumed that Britain would not sell empire to buy United States friendship, but he lacked the resources to resist American pressure. Economic ruin at home, rationing continued until the 1950s, meant that colonies were no longer cash cows but cash drains. In early 1947, the British Indian Empire finally reached its breaking point. With communal violence between Hindus and Muslims spiraling into bloodshed, Prime Minister Clement Attlee's government rushed through the Indian Independence Act. On August 15, 1947, the British Raj, 190-year project of conquest and governance, disappeared in a dawn of rayons and rifles. Two new nations, India and Pakistan, awoke to sovereignty amidst fanfares and funerals. Nightmarish migrations followed, 15 million people on the march, communal massacres leaving 1 million dead. British officials watched from departing trains, astonished that their years of divide and rule had yielded a partition more brutal than any colonial rebellion. The empire's keystone shattered, and with it the myth of indispensability. As news of India's partition reverberated, other colonies seized the moment. In Ceylon, Sinhala and Tamil politicians demanded immediate dominion status. In Burma, Aung San negotiated with British commanders for a similar path. Gold Coast nationalists mobilized mass political demonstrations. The outgoing governor offered a 1951 constitution with an elected assembly, but only if leaders pledged loyalty to the Queen. In Malaya, ethnic Malay and Chinese leaders united to demand a Malayan union, to be overseen by a British governor but accountable to elected representatives. Even in stubborn southern Rhodesia, African nationalists formed the Federal African National Congress, challenging the white minority government. The impulse was clear. If the British could grant dominion to India overnight, why not extend the same to other territories? Britain's answer was an uneasy compromise: the creation of the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of equal sovereign states under the symbolic headship of the Crown. India's choice to remain within this association, despite abandoning the monarch as head of state, lent legitimacy to the idea. The 1949 London Declaration allowed republics to join so long as they recognized the sovereign as the symbol of their free association. It was clever rebranding. Formal sovereignty replaced direct rule, but Britain retained cultural ties, preferential trade agreements, and military alliances. Dirk Peidel's memorandum in the Colonial Office mused that this Commonwealth model could slow the hemorrhage of empire while preserving strategic interests, yet real power had shifted irrevocably. From 1947 to 1960, nearly 30 new nations appeared on the UN roster: India, Pakistan, Burma, Sri Lanka, Ghana, Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, Malaya, Singapore, Cyprus, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Malawi, and more. Each achieved independence through negotiation rather than conquest, in a global wave of decolonization that came to be called the wind of change. British politicians invoked the phrase with equal parts awe and alarm. We must act as a landlord, offers tenants a lease, not evict them with force. Yet beneath the rhetoric lay a bitter truth: economic imperatives, sterling balances depleted, loans from the US and IMF mounting, meant the mother country could no longer subsidize an imperial garrison. In South Africa, the National Party seized power in 1948 and instituted apartheid, contravening Commonwealth principles of equality. Britain faced its first major post-war crisis. Should it expel a white-ruled dominion that flouted human rights? The solution was to allow South Africa to withdraw in 1961, rather than confront it with sanctions, a retreat that foreshadowed future half measures. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the 1956 Suez Crisis revealed the final curtain call of imperial muscle. When President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France invaded alongside Israel, but were forced to withdraw under US and Soviet pressure. Prime Minister Eden, once bulldog of the Commons, resigned in disgrace. The humiliating defeat signaled Britain's strategic impotence and underscored the reality that the empire's age had passed. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the remaining colonies in the Caribbean, Pacific, and Indian Ocean moved toward independence. Barbados, 1966, Mauritius, 1968, Fiji, 1970, the Maldives, 1965, Belize, 1981. Each transition was accompanied by a handshake with the Queen, a transfer of gubernatorial robes, and a final lowering of the Union Jack. In Hong Kong, a British territory for 156 years, the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984 set a handover date of 1997, after which the crown colony would become a special administrative region of China. The spectacle of the final governor, tearful, reflective, ceremonial, epitomized the end of an era. Yet even as the Union Jack descended over colonial flagpoles, the empire's legacy endured in complex ways. English language and legal systems persisted in courts. Cricket and rugby remained national pastimes. Educational curricula retained chapters on Victoria's valor. Philanthropic institutions, British Council, Commonwealth Fund, continued to fund cultural exchanges and scholarships. Air routes bore names like Imperial Airways until rebranding ushered in British Airways. And perhaps most tellingly, the Commonwealth Games became a quadrennial reminder that former colonies and dominions still saw value in a shared sporting oast at festival under the Commonwealth banner. But nostalgia for empire was never universal. In post-colonial societies, debates raged over monuments to colonial figures, street names honoring governors, and the repatriation of museum artifacts. Calls to remove statues of Rhodes at Oxford or Clive in Kolkata became flashpoints in struggles over historical memory. Universities and museums launched decolonization initiatives, rewriting curriculums, rotating exhibits to tell indigenous stories, and repatriating sacred objects. The empire's grand narratives of progress and civilization were replaced by counter-narratives of exploitation and resilience. At the end of the 20th century, Britain itself grappled with the costs and meanings of empire. The Windrush scandal, in which Caribbean-born Commonwealth citizens were wrongfully detained or deported, revealed the hypocrisies in immigration policies toward former colonial subjects. Debates over reparations for slavery and indentured labor demanded ethical reckonings. Public inquiries into colonial-era atrocities in Kenya's Mau Mau Rebellion, in Malaya's emergency, and in Cyprus and Aden forced Britain to acknowledge abuses once covered by the cloak of necessity. Empire, long painted as a benevolent mission, was now scrutinized under the harsh light of accountability. As we close this final chapter, reflect on the arc from tea and taxes in the 18th century to partition and passports in the 20th. The British Empire did not collapse in a single cataclysm but shrank through a series of negotiations, conflicts, and compromises, each step driven by the friction between imperial ambition and colonial aspiration. What remains is a mosaic of nations linked by language, law, and shared history, and a cautionary tale of how power built on convenient myths of superiority can crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. In today's globalized world, the ghosts of empire linger in trade agreements, military alliances, and cultural affinities. The Commonwealth, once a fig leaf for imperial control, now serves as a platform for dialogue and development among diverse nations. Yet the question endures, how do we honor shared histories without perpetuating old injustices? The story of the British Empire's shrinkage is above all a story of human agency, of colonized peoples who demanded rights, of leaders who chose pragmatism over dogma, and of an empire that ultimately recognized that the only sustainable way to govern is by consent rather than coercion. May this saga of tea, taxes, and trouble remind us that the true measure of power lies not in dominion over lands, but in the respect we earned from those we once claimed as subjects.